Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas. And if Shane was here, he would say, you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So let's get to headlines. We are having a little bit of a technical issue this morning, but we're going to work through it either way. So let's get to the headlines. In the news, responding Tuesday to the surging COVID-19 pandemic, Governor Tim Walz announced dial-back measures that close bars and restaurants at 10 p.m. and restrict the size of weddings and funeral receptions, as well as indoor and outdoor gatherings. Quote, we turn our dials forward. We're going to have to turn them back a bit today, unquote, Walz said during an afternoon news conference. State officials said the new restrictions are targeted to settings where the coronavirus is spreading. Quote, this is where we can have the biggest impact in the shortest amount of time without the massive disruption, Walz said. A trade group representing bars and restaurants said the earlier closing time was unfair and would cause financial harm. Governor Tony Evers is urging, but not requiring, limits on public interaction on a day of record inflation and deaths as Wisconsin hospitals are running out of intensive care beds. Evers, on Tuesday evening, delivering a statewide address and issued an executive order to make the case to the public. Please stay home. It's the first time the governor has used the primetime platform to ask the public to begin to take pandemic seriously 9 months into the outbreak. Quote, Wisconsin, this is serious. This crisis is urgent, unquote. Evers said in a speech from the Wisconsin state capitol. It is not safe to go out. It is not safe to have others over. It is just not safe. And it might not be safe for a while yet, unquote. Los Angeles City Council members have requested that the city look into transforming Los Angeles Convention Center into a homeless shelter. Councilman Karen Price, who introduced the motion, said the coronavirus pandemic had worsened the problems for the city's homeless, and elected officials needed to act. Quote, we're in a panic situation along the pandemic situation. Folks on the streets are just suffering, he said. Getting people off the streets is important. The push comes as the council members are currently under pressure from the U.S. District Judge David O. Carter to shelter homeless people in their districts. Carter is overseeing a lawsuit which alleges that the city and the county have not done enough to get homeless people off the streets. Price's 9th district, which includes the convention center, has more than 4,800 homeless people in 2020. While there are 2,700 homeless people on the streets in his district, nearly half are sheltered, a rate well above the city's average. He also urges that the convention business won't be returning for years due to the outbreak. The center has mainly stayed empty as health rules currently prohibit large-scale events there. Let's move on to election news. Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick announced Tuesday that he would pay up to $1 million from his campaign account to incentivize, encourage, and reward people to come forward and report voter fraud from anywhere in the country. Quote, whistleblowers and tipsters should turn over the evidence to local law enforcement. Anyone who provides information that leads to the arrest and final conviction of voter fraud will be paid a minimum of $25,000, said Patrick in news release. Trump is going to get his day in court. Don't worry about that. The British government plans to increase its power to block or modify foreign investment in the UK on national security grounds under legislation to be introduced on Wednesday. The National Security and Investment Bill will require businesses to notify the government about deals in sensitive industries, including defense, transportations, communications, and artificial intelligence. The government would then have 30 days to review the transactions and impose conditions on those deemed to pose a risk to national security. The legislation, which applies to technology and intellectual property as well as corporate takeovers, follows similar moves by the United States and Australia amid increasing concerns about investment from potential hostile countries such as China. Quote, the UK remains one of the most attractive investment destinations in the world, and we want to keep it that way, unquote, Business Secretary Alok Sharma said in a statement. But hostile actors should be in no doubt. There is no back door in the UK. You know, it's funny. If that was China, the first thing they would be calling that is authoritarian, even though it is rational for the UK to have control over their markets. Any country would. Egypt's president is meeting with Greek officials in Athens on Wednesday in his first visit to southern European nations since the two countries signed a deal demarcating maritime boundaries between them and the eastern Mediterranean. President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi was holding talks with the Greek president and prime minister in the morning, while Ethiopian foreign minister Sameth Soroki will sit down with Greek counterpart Nikos Dias in the evening. In August, Greece and Egypt signed a maritime deal demarcating the two countries' maritime boundaries and setting out respective exclusive economic zones for the exploitation of resources such as oil and gas drilling. The agreement angered Turkey, which has accused Greece of trying to grab an unfair share of the resources in the eastern Mediterranean. Tensions has been high since Greece and Turkey, both NATO members, with Ankara sending a seismic research vessel into areas that Athens claims is its own continental shelf. The dispute has led both countries' warships facing off in the eastern Mediterranean and raised fears that it could lead to open conflict. I swear, Turkey has its hands in everything. Bahrain's Prince Khalifa bin Salman Al Khalifa, one of the world's longest-serving prime ministers who led his island nation government for decades, has survived the 2011 Arab Spring protests that demanded his ouster over corruption allegations, died on Wednesday. He was 84 years old. Bahrain's state-run news agency announced his death, saying that he had been receiving treatments at the Mayo Clinic in the United States without elaborating. The Mayo Clinic did not immediately respond to a request for comment. Prince Khalifa's power and wealth could be seen everywhere in the small nation off the coast of Saudi Arabia's home to the U.S. Fifth Fleet. His official portrait hung for decades on the wall alongside the country's ruler. He had his own private island where he met foreign dignitaries, complete with a marina and a park that had peacocks and a gazelle roam its grounds. Potsdam State Office for the Environment approved another preliminary permit for the construction of Tesla's Gigafactory in Berlin. The EV automaker was allowed to continue building its casting factory for the Model Y production. Continued construction work around the foundry has also been allowed. According to the local press release, approval for the recent preliminary permit was possible because it did not require any additional use of land or impact the environment further. Tesla has applied for a 6th early permit approval to start building a revolutionary paint shop and clear more of the trees in the forest. Approval for the 6th permit is still pending, as it requires extensive examination. Gigafactory, those things are massive. Shane, are you here?
I am. How's it going, Jamarl?
I'm doing all right. Have you seen those gigafactories? Those things are phenomenally huge.
I have. Yeah, those remind me of the era of Henry Ford, something like that, or scientific efficiency. You have a building that's effectively a machine with people in it. A little bit scary, but apparently very efficient. Yeah, those are crazy looking.
Yeah, Tesla, that stock, man, is such a weird bird. I mean, you have something that's in EVs, electronic vehicles. You have automated driving. You have battery technology. And all of this is basically within one product and within one company. And all of these can spawn different research chains by themselves. Tesla is a fascinating company. So, every other day we hear about its demise. And yet the potential is clearly there. One of the world's biggest grain exporting houses signed an agreement on Wednesday to sell 45% stake in the Abu Dhabi Sovereign Wealth Fund. Both companies announced. The development comes as the United Arab Emirates, a federation of 7 desert sheikdoms, seek to improve its food security in the face of growing global challenges such as climate change. Louis Dreyfus Company, a family-owned commodities trading giant, reached a deal to sell an indirect equity stake in Abu Dhabi's ADQ, one of the region's largest holding companies. Louis Dreyfus also said that it signed a long-term supply agreement with the state-owned company to sell agricultural goods to the UAE. The decision to sell the big stake in the family-owned company marks a milestone in Louis Dreyfus' decade-long strategy, said Chairman Margaret Louis Dreyfus. ADQ hailed the agreement as a strategic move for the UAE, which, with its desert soil and searing heat, imports 90% of its food from abroad, leaving the country acutely vulnerable to food shortages caused by erratic weather and regional instability. Wow, 90%. That is dramatic. The drinks group Diageo, I think that's how that's pronounced, is recalling all of its newly launched non-alcoholic stout because of microbiological contamination only 2 weeks after it was launched. It warned that the cans of the new Guinness 0.0 drink, which took 4 years to develop, may be unsafe to consume, and advised people who purchase the alcohol-free beer to dispose of it or return it to where it was bought. The contamination is understood to have occurred during the production process at its St. James Gate Brewery in Dublin, and tests are being carried out to establish the cause. In the meantime, production and canning has been halted. Those are your headlines. You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I want to slide in one more headline here, and this has to do with information that came out about COVID. I think this was a couple of days ago, where they were showing that 1 in 5 people who've been diagnosed with COVID within 90 days has some kind of mental illness. Now, this just adds a whole nother level onto it, because at that point, it's not an issue of whether this person is going to recover. Well, yeah, the overwhelming majority of people cover. That's not it. The issue is also the additional consequences as people deal with it. And by the way, this could be from a person being worried about it. This could be because a person feels like they're shut into the house. But the problem is 65% of the people with mental illness were more likely to get it, which means that goes beyond this notion that the person with mental illness feels some kind of way because they have it. This goes into something about the mental illness itself making people more susceptible to COVID. It's a fascinating study that came out the other day. So I just want to stick that one in. We always talk about COVID news, and that was one of the, again, weirder aspects of this virus.
There are also comorbidities. So, I mean, it generally, mental illnesses are associated in a lot of cases with physical illnesses. You get like overlap of like your genes having sort of run amok slightly or something like this, or just in general comorbidities. I don't mean to read into exactly why. So, that could also include autoimmune problems. That could include potentially obesity problems like that are going to make you more susceptible to COVID. That's what comes to mind. Not a doctor, but that comes to mind.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, that totally makes sense. It's just, this virus has been very bizarre. And, trying to do the science in the moment, it's just been very fascinating to watch. Like I said, most of the time, science is this kind of subtle thing where you hear people talk about these theories after the fact, and it feels like there's magic involved. And then you see the sausage being made. And it's like, wait a minute, where's the magic? It's not magic, it's research. It's experimentation. That's all you got. That's our way of organizing our world, right? So let's do this. Let's take a quick break, and we will be back. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Peer into the future with Political Misfits on Thursdays when we analyze the latest trends in news, politics, and culture. Catch us on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Achtung, baby.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM at 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming us on, definitely give us a like and share that content. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement makes the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy to call in. You know, I've been watching the results of this race. I've watched going all the way back. I think I've been doing my show for the entire time of this election, so I've been uber acute in regards to the politics over the last several years. And to be honest, this even goes back further of this kind of passive paying attention, where there was this kind of historical looking back in time and trying to understand what took place. Right now, you have a situation where a president of the United States is refusing to concede. Now, whatever the problems that are associated with this who rules question, and what does it mean for a president to basically not give his following or not give his people saying, okay, this other person won this race, where there's this understanding in the country that this guy lost, this guy won. You may hate this guy's guts, but the guy still won. And the legitimacy itself, almost like a spotlight from spotlight from God, is bestowed upon the individual to which the public chooses. What happens when you don't know as a flat fact who the public chose? What happens is a race to the bottom and a continued delegitimization of the next person who comes in office. Doesn't matter whether they were able to get in legitimately or not. As political strategy goes, delegitimize. I think people need to really question where this goes and where do they believe this is going to go. Where do you think your country end up going down this continued path? You have Barack Obama, who's running in office. He becomes president of the United States. They scream that he is a Kenyan Muslim Manchurian candidate that snuck into the country to destroy America and to take it into some kind of socialist direction. Forgetting the fact that in an interview, Obama himself said that if he was regarded in the 80s, he would have been considered a conservative, because that's the way his policies were. They kept calling this guy socialist and calling this guy communist, and at the end of the day, the guy gave 95% of the income gains to the top 1%. Does that sort of mischaracterization, does that do a disservice to the country or not, from the standpoint of just lying? What about the giving 95% of the income to the top 1%? Does that do a disservice? And does calling Obama a socialist give him cover for doing just that? You also had this group who basically agreed to unmitigated or unrelenting opposition to the president. Didn't matter what he wanted. There were even policies that Obama was pushing that were basically Republican policies for a few years on. And even those were off the table. Go back and look at the meeting that these guys had on the Obama inauguration night, where these guys were despondent and came up with a political strategy to not work with him for anything, because working with him for anything would give him a win. If Obama's political strategy is, I'm going to be a peacemaker and I'm going to reach across the aisle and there is no red and blue America, what's the obvious strategy? No, there is a red and blue America. You're not going to reach across the aisle because that requires two. And we're going to try to make you a one-term president by making you fail at everything that you do. Political strategy. But think to yourself for a moment. Is that really what they're supposed to be doing in that office. Think about this idea of America. Think about the idea of the people who are living on the streets or with healthcare issues or with millions of dollars on their back in debts for the temerity of trying to get an education. Think of all of the crises and the issues that are affecting this country. And one of the political parties basically said, I'm not going to try to work with the other guy. I'm just going to try to make him fail. That's my objective. One-term presidency. The concept of America matters less. Even to the Supreme Court, where they were going to let the Supreme Court die on the vine. Go back and look at those comments that these guys were making, saying maybe we don't need a Supreme Court, with the thought being we're not going to put in Obama's pick. And the assumption was that Hillary Clinton was going to win, and the questions were even how long could we go without even putting in her pick? Like, this is astonishing stuff that we're talking about. This is basically government ripping itself apart with political parties looking out for their own interests and their own constituents. And I don't mean the voters. I don't mean the voters. In lieu of the country as a whole. You get Donald Trump coming in. Donald Trump was one of the key people saying that Obama wasn't born here, screaming for his birth certificate. And when Trump gets in, returning the favor, Democrats say, you got in because Vladimir Putin put you on his shoulders, riding a bear, ran across the finish line. And that was the only way you won. Meaning, completely delegitimize Donald Trump's win. Instead of it being this kind of mind-blowing win, even if they wanted to point to interstate cross-check, even if they wanted to point to the scrubbing people off the voter rolls, they didn't do any of that. They immediately went to a foreign body attacking democracy itself, rubbing its finger up Lady Liberty's dress, embarrassing her in front of the world. This was the nonsense that they went by. And for the entire time, delegitimize Trump's presidency in a similar way that they did to Obama. Back and forth, this topsy-turvy, one act justifying the behavior of the other in a race to the bottom. Not only did they do that, they got to the point of almost a soft coup of dragging Trump out of that seat. They knew, buried, that the CEO of CrowdStrike didn't have any hard evidence that the Russians pulled any information out or that the information was exfiltrated, quote unquote, at all. They knew it. They buried that information. Schiff right now still comes out and screams about the Russians. And they still make these illusions that they're attacking the electoral system and that they somehow got Donald Trump elected. They undermine his win by making it look as if he didn't win on his own. Biden gets in office, and what happens? Predictably, delegitimizing the win. Where does this go? Think about what I'm asking you for a moment. Where does this go? Each party continuously delegitimizes the other party, Democrat or Republican. Democrats didn't have anything for the Russiagate nonsense. I don't see anything here but the election fraud stuff, and Donald Trump is still screaming it. He was going to scream election fraud anyway. I'm making somewhat of a more subtle point. Where do you believe this goes? With one party justifying the actions with the other party's actions, back in, this kind of topsy-turvy, this logic of war, where your side and your tribe gets goosed up over something that the other guy did, completely ignoring what their own behavior is in the process. What happens? What happens in 2024? What happens in 2020? I'm trying to make the very basic point that we can't continue going this way. And we can have our political disagreements, we can have our political fights, all of that stuff is fair game. And you should have those fights because you're representing the interests of a constituency that looks to you as being, let's say, the avatar of their will and to be their voice. But there's something else to be said about this notion of being able of functioning under the idea of best interests for the whole or the collective. And that seemed to be entirely off the table these days. And it's just raw political combat. Maybe it's because there's so much to gain. Maybe the 95% of the income to the top 1%, the fighting for the Wall Street, the contingents that are going to get X money or this other type of money. Maybe it's just gotten to such a historical scenario that all stops need to be pulled out in order to win. I don't know. I'm making the point that a country cannot survive, continuously going with this race to the bottom. Shane, there are times where I can be overtly cynical when I'm looking at politics. And I can look at this from a high level where I ignore the human element of the stuff, meaning the people that need help. People get into politics, ideally, at least me, because I wanted to get things accomplished. I could see the pain of individuals and in poverty. I could see the pain of people trying to make a life in the world, the crime, the illness, that stuff is caused, the environmental factors that inspire behavior. And I say to myself, there needs to be a political solution to this. And I think you push. That's politics. Well, not everybody gets into politics for that. And sometimes when you're fighting on that front, it's easier to ignore the pain of the individuals because it somehow inhibits your action. And oddly enough, but you can't. It's a weird thing where you get power from those individuals that are in pain. You get power seeing the atrocities of things that you consider to be vagaries of nature, vagaries of our society. That stuff gives you power. By the same token, it is difficult to operate from that level where your emotions are entwined in whatever you're dealing with. And so almost from the standpoint of the repetition of it all, it creates a certain deadening in the way that you engage it. But we should never forget that the underlying point of all of this stuff is to get things accomplished, at least from my standpoint. And that should not be something we forget. There's an underlying reality of human beings to whatever politics that we're talking about. But what do you think about this? I consider this a race to the bottom. And this situation just seems to get worse and worse, one election after the next.
It does seem to be getting that way. Yeah, I mean, just to address like the last part of what you were talking about, you're right. When you're sitting at the top of some mechanism of power, when you're sitting at the top of some system that is constructed and run and maintained by human beings, but that system has its own intents, and you're sort of trying to guide that system, then you start to view and use people as tools. And what comes with that, of course, is, like you're saying, necessarily a deadening. The people who get put into those positions tend to be people who have the capacity to sort of deaden their sensitivities, and they need to. And there's no not really slighting that, because again, our entire civilization, as far as I can tell, is run by various systems of various sizes that work like this. The other thing, I just want to sort of step back for a second. If you dramatically simplify things, and over the course of human history, you look at like a couple of different forms of government. You look at oligarchy or an aristocracy. You look at monarchy, some sort of despotism. You look at democracy. What we have is, just compare us for a moment with like either a monarchy or an aristocracy. With a monarchy and an aristocracy, you usually get like lines of succession where you have a generational turnover, and often every generation or so, there are these massive fights, and literally a lot of blood would occasionally get shed deciding who exactly is going to be the next king or baron or duke or prince or whatever. At democracy, ostensibly, the goal is it happens fairly periodically. You have this, instead of it being a generational thing with lots of bloodshed, you have it happen every 2 or 4 or 6 or 8 years with a lot of votes cast. And it's supposed to be a lot more peaceful, and frankly, it usually is. But what's happening now is that the succession crisis that you would see in a monarchy is getting more and more pitched in the states through our democracy, to the point where in 2016, and there was a kind of an attempted coup, a successful coup within the DNC in some sense, to take the power away from the voters and keep it within the hands of the party apparatus. In 2020. Both sides are calling this a coup. The Democrats were saying that Trump was planning a coup in advance, and now the Republicans are saying that the Democrats successfully threw one. So it's getting more and more pitched, and at some point, you're saying it might hit rock bottom. That's the fear. That's what we were afraid of course, looking into this election. Now, what that exactly looks like, what level of violence that precipitates, is an open question, and frankly, one I think we're all a bit afraid to ask. But yeah, I think that's where it's headed. Jamarl, what's your take?
No, I agree with you. I mean, it's disconcerting, to put it mildly. This goes beyond Trump, by the way. Like when I'm making this argument, I'm not making this argument specifically for Trump, because it wasn't Trump that screamed Russiagate and didn't want to accept the fact that they lost all those years. That was the Democratic Party. And they had media lackeys and everybody else to help them with it. But this is not a Trump issue. This is a representative government issue, or a collapse thereof issue. It gives me qualms because it doesn't seem like this gets better. It only seems like this gets worse before it ever gets better. But let's do this. Let's take a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas, myself, and my co-host, Shane Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan, and our guest, Gareth Porter. He's an investigative journalist, author, and policy analyst specializing in U.S. national security policy. Gareth, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
Good morning. I'm fine. How are you?
Good. We brought you on to talk about events happening before and after the election. We'll get to the second in a minute. With the events that happened before, you actually have an article up over at thegrayzone.com talking about what happened with the DHS and the FBI in the weeks leading up to the election, to this past Tuesday. And specifically, these allegations that Russians had tried to hack into the election services. Now, one of the points that you make, and I want to start there, is that the story they're spinning is so crazy that it might suggest that internally they were sort of scrambling to find anything to throw out there. It suggests an internal panic, I think was the word you used, about there not being a there there. Could you please tell us what you mean by that, Gareth?
Indeed. Well, that was what I said, and I was thinking precisely along those lines. And I think what we're talking about here is that the Trump administration clearly wanted to have something that they were going to be able to accuse Iran of. That was the thing that was really on the minds of the senior officials there. But the people in the national security state who were more permanent, shall we say, meaning the people in the Department of Homeland Security, Cybersecurity Agency, and people in the FBI as well, also wanted to get something on the Russians. And they had been saying for years, and particularly in recent months, that the Russians were going to do something to try to interfere with the election in 2020, and they had found themselves really kind of tied up with this narrative, and they had to come up with some way of dealing with the fact that there was no evidence that was happening, that there was nothing there. There was no there. And so what they came up with in their wisdom was this idea that the Russians could basically say after the election that they had succeeded in breaking into some kind of election-related website, and that this would be a way to cast doubt on the credibility of American democracy and American elections. And of course, that's what I was referring to when I used that language, that this was so outrageous, so outlandish, that it suggested some kind of desperation on their part. Because, I mean, no sane person would suggest that a foreign government would publicly claim that it had done something that it hadn't done when, this is something that the United States desperately wanted to accuse them of in the first place.
Absolutely. And so this is you're talking about for years now. I mean, obviously, Russiagate starting back in 2016, trying to demonize Russia, and Trump at the same time, painting both with a broad brush and accusing the other of working with each other. That sort of set the frame. Of course, there's a deep history there with the Cold War. But then, like you're saying, leading up to this election officials have been warning that Russia would try to interfere in 2020. Basically, the case you're making is that didn't happen. Nothing like that happened. And so they were sort of scrambling for loose ends here.
Yeah, it didn't happen. Indeed, if you look at at what they had put out in October, both DHS, Cybersecurity Agency, and FBI had put out in early October an alert, they call it, in which they talked about basically some what they call APT, which are the permanent threats to cybersecurity. And those are hackers, basically, which were unidentified. And by implication, they had no evidence that there was any sort of official link with them. But basically, hackers who had broken into some official sites in the United States that included a couple of sites that had some degree of involvement in election matters, but they had no reason to believe, as they said in this October alert, that there was any danger to election material that would affect the election. So that was the closest they ever came to anything suggesting hackers would threaten the election. And then, on October 22nd, they suggested that there was an official Russian connection with this for the first time, and that was obviously, it seems to me, a result of political pressure from the top. That there were people who wanted to actually get the Russians, and this was the way to do it. But there was inconsistency between those two alerts, which gave away that this was simply another game, a political game being played.
Gareth, I want to pivot slightly to information that's coming out that seems like Trump is trying to release data. Gina Haspel, Bloody Gina Haspel, was seen going, head of the CIA, was seen going into Mitch McConnell's office. Now, that's somewhat odd. I mean, that's not something you see all the time. And the fact that the oddity of it was the reason why it was being reported. There are two thoughts on that. One thought is that Trump is going to fire her. I don't know what that matters at this point if Trump loses the race. It's kind of neither here nor there. But the other thought was that Trump wants to release information. And he wants to release information behind the scenes, and he's getting heavy pushback from various members of the intelligence community, Haspel apparently being one of them. Do you know anything about what's going on with this? Like basically this kind of push to release data and release information in the White House?
I don't. I don't have any inside sources, as I'm sure you're aware at this point. I operate on a totally different basis, so I've got nothing from the inside on that subject. But it is clear that Gina Haspel, is in trouble in terms of her position. I mean that Trump has not really liked her performance, or doesn't like her. I don't know exactly what the problem is, but she has not been popular with Trump. And of course, Trump is firing all kinds of top-level national security people, particularly in the Pentagon, which is a very well-known story at this point. And so Haspel's head is certainly potentially on the block here. That could account for the fact that she was, in a congressional office. I have no idea what the actual business being transacted was. But no, I don't know anything about the potential release of information through Haspel or anybody else.
Yeah, specifically the rumor going around right now, and who knows what to chalk that up to, is that following the firing of Mark Esper, he's also planning on firing Haspel, like we were just talking about, director of the CIA, as well as Chris Wray, head of the FBI. So that would be, a big shakeup, but pretty much all of the planks of the national security establishment, established national security establishment. Gareth, what's your take on that?
Well, I think that's very disturbing. I think that under the circumstances where the president is still sort of trying to hang on to power and refuses, apparently, from all the sources that I've seen, to acknowledge that he is defeated, has been defeated. This kind of purge of people in the Pentagon and FBI, if that report is correct, and it certainly is credible, that sort of purge does not bode well for his mentality in terms of trying to resist somehow. Who knows what plan, or if not a plan, at least some urge he has in mind to try to do something to hold on to power. But from my point of view, it is disturbing.
And where do you think that would go? Just to be clear, we're talking about a potential coup by the president of the United States. This is after years of what I would say was a very slow attempted coup by the Democrats, specifically with Russiagate, working with the media, and literally with the impeachment, which, although it failed, was like their last hurrah at trying to make that story pan out. What do you think he would actually do here, Gareth?
I don't think he can do anything, but, that's different. A different question from what may be going on in his own mind. From all accounts, he's acting in a very confused and, shall we say, resisting reality sort of way. Apparently, Kushner and his wife are urging him to acknowledge reality, and he's still doing so. And I just don't know what he could possibly have in mind, but and maybe it's nothing more than just simply flailing out, right? That's most likely. It's most likely that that's the case.
It seems like he didn't necessarily have the institutional support. Trump wasn't their ilk, let's say it that way, part of the established order. Whether or not, I think you make a really good point. What he could do versus what is in his own mind are two very different things. And what that looks like kind of an experiential reality, like what that materially looks like in our country, meaning the people who fall, like for Pompeo. When Pompeo was asked, Pompeo was like, we're going to usher in the new administration. And people were like, what are you talking about? Even Fox News was looking at him like, are you being serious? Now, Pompeo is one of those people that said he lied, cheated, and stole for a living. So you can't really take much, what anything of that Pompeo says legitimately. But I do think there's something to be said for if he gets a bunch of sycophants that back him up, even if it's just for political reasons. You have some political actors who want to get elected and who believes that their pathway to getting elected is pretending that Trump won. I think this is an unfortunate outcome. Even, like you say, even if it just tarnishes the idea of who won, it's still an unfortunate outcome.
It's an interesting question. What kind of person would take the job at this moment under these circumstances? Because it would be freighted with a lot of negative implications, that's for sure. Your credibility would be certainly damaged by taking a job under the circumstances that we've seen in recent days.
You're talking about effectively coming in to act as a potential tool in maintaining Trump's power, right?
Well, even in the best scenario, that you're taking a job that some people would suggest would have that implication, even if it's not very serious. But definitely, it is a situation where, being associated with Trump in a moment when he's exhibiting such a total lack of realism, it's not a good career move, I would think. just off the top of my head.
I hear you. We've got to go into a break right now. We are joined by Gareth Porter, investigative journalist, author, and policy analyst specializing in U.S. national security policy. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and myself, Shane Stranahan. We'll be back on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines.
shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of Washington, D.C. Joining us today is Gareth Porter, investigative journalist, author, and policy analyst. Gareth, I'm sorry. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
He dropped.
Oh, okay. I see what's going on. Okay, well, he'll be back. Gareth will be back in a few. But specializing in investigative journalism, author, and policy analyst, specializing in U.S. national security policy. We're trying to get Gareth back. He'll be back in a few. I kind of want to get into foreign policy, and especially what does a Biden administration mean with foreign policy? I asked this question, Shane, because Joe Biden didn't get into office saying he was going to be anything outside of just not being Trump, which is kind of a wide berth. Right? It's like, I don't know what you're going to do in that office, and I only can make certain assumptions of what you're going to do based on previous Democrats and based on the last guy you were in office with. And that is not, I don't know, encouraging, to put it mildly. I mean, I just saw the report out this morning talking about Syria, where Biden is basically saying he's going to undo what Trump did in Syria. Basically, he's going to put troops back in. It's astonishing.
He's back.
Oh, excellent. So, Gareth, thank you for coming back. We're getting into this question of foreign policy and what Biden is going to be doing from the standpoint of foreign policy. Now, a report came out this morning basically talking about Biden is going to undo Trump's changes in Syria. I suppose he's going to try to get troops back in. What is the policy on the Iran deal, the JCPOA? I've seen Biden seem to vacillate on this. At some points, he didn't even seem to know what it was. But what is his policy, as we know, or that we're aware of, going forward on this specific issue towards Iran?
Look, I doubt very much if Biden has a very clear notion of what he's going to do about this, because it's very complicated in terms of how you work out a deal to get back into the JCPOA, or to basically reestablish the minimum bases of the JCPOA. It's been so seriously damaged. I mean, it's all but dead. And, you know, for Biden to be able to revive it requires, you know, a whole series of steps over some period of time. It can't happen immediately. And he's going to have to work with European allies, UK, Germany, and France, as well as with Iran to do this. And basically, it would require, because I'm not confident that he's going to do this, that he's going to be willing to do this, it's going to require that he make concessions to Iran in comparison, certainly with what the Trump administration was the position they were taking, the demands that they had voiced early on in the Trump administration, specifically, for example, demanding that Iran must essentially give up its ballistic missile program or submit to such onerous conditions surrounding it that it would amount to the same thing. And let's face it, the Democrats, generally speaking, have lined up in support of that. That was the Obama administration position, more or less, that Iran's ballistic missile program was largely illegitimate because they claimed they could carry, those ballistic missiles could carry nuclear weapons. That was false. I've written about this extensively, but this is a long time sort of centrist Democratic Party position, Democratic administration position. And Biden certainly is not going to name somebody to the Pentagon who is to the left of that, and very probably will name somebody, i.e. Flournoy, who's to the right of that. So, the prospects for working something out here, in my view, are not very good. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's not going to happen easily. And the probability, it seems to me, is that he's going to make demands that are going to be unacceptable to Iran in order to restore the JCPOA.
Gareth, thank you for coming back. I want to ask a sort of a broad question here. The U.S. has a volatile foreign policy. Over the course of specifically the Trump administration, he walked back from the international scene dramatically. Earlier, he's been trying to pull troops out of Afghanistan. Biden is now saying he's reconsidering that with the JCPOA. Obviously, you were just talking about there's a notorious wavering from the U.S. on where exactly we're going to fall on that, whether or not we should reinstate it, what we should be pushing for in our relationship with Iran in general. And it seems to me, unless there's a sufficient pushback to Trump by the establishment as such, by the national security establishment, unless it manages to entrench itself more deeply in power, this is probably going to continue and get worse over coming presidential administrations. Where does that go in the long run? I mean, this is, for all the talk about America as a superpower and its potentially receding role, specifically under the Trump administrations, one of the deeper problems that I see with America as a diplomatic middle ground, which it sort of painted itself as over the past couple of decades at least, as a sort of international intermediary here. One of the big obstacles to that is simply that we seem to be increasingly unpredictable from other countries' perspectives. Where does that stop? Is that just going to keep going? Where do you think that's going to go, Gareth?
Well, I think unpredictability is going to be a problem. No question about it. It reached a peak under Trump for obvious reasons, but some of those reasons were good reasons. That is to say, he took positions that were not in line with the traditional military-industrial complex national security state interests. He waffled, unfortunately, too much with regard to some of these decisions, particularly on Syria, for example. I think that a Democratic administration under Trump is going to be it's going to be subject to the same dynamics that we saw under Obama, which were, first of all, that he's bought into completely the interests of the national security state. There's some feeble resistance on some issues, some moderate resistance on others, but for the most part, it means accepting the fundamental premises of the national security state, which have persisted over many decades. And, I do believe that Michelle Flournoy is going to become the Secretary of Defense, and she's going to be pushing this even farther to the right in terms of, if you will, in terms of those interests on a whole series of fronts. And the one that I'm most concerned about, frankly, is China, because I think that that's where the United States faces the greatest risk of sort of wandering into a war situation because of a policy that has been primarily geared to the interests of the national security state, has nothing to do with the true interests of the United States. And by that I mean that the United States is trying to re-establish its hegemony, its supremacy militarily in East Asia, specifically in the South China Sea, where China has challenged it over the past couple of decades increasingly, and now is in a situation where the United States would not do all that well if it found itself getting into a war with China. And so the United States is now entering into a new period of intensive military buildup with broad new technologies, new strategies that revolutionize its role in East Asia. And it's going to take 10 to 15 years for the United States to achieve all that. And, the Chinese are not going to wait around for the United States to achieve that new status. Their interest is going to be to move to ensure that Taiwan is not going to become an independent state, which is what we're seeing the trend line be for the last, particularly the last year or so, but even longer to some extent. And so the Chinese, they're going to be very strongly pushed in the direction of moving militarily during the period in which the United States is making this big, huge buildup. So I think the biggest worry of a Biden presidency is going to be what the United States is doing in East Asia, specifically with regard to China and Taiwan.
And as far as I understand, Russia and China have military agreements, meaning basically a war with one is basically a war with both. Am I understanding that right?
Well, that was the case during the Cold War. I mean, it hasn't really been the case, to my knowledge, for quite a few years. I don't know that there's a pledge by Russia to come to China's aid militarily if they get into a war with the United States. Perhaps I've missed something. I mean, it's possible that there's some sort of language there that could be read in that way. But my perception is that the two are cooperating, but there's not a sort of traditional security commitment between them, such as there was early in the Cold War. But later in the Cold War, as you know, that was ruptured.
Yeah, as far as I know right now, there is no military alliance. There's just a strategic partnership, and there's economic ties largely with Russia selling China oil, et cetera. So there, a degree of interdependency that would suggest a potential alliance in the long run, but right now there's not a mutual pact right there. So we've covered China, we've covered Iran, a couple other countries I just want to throw in here real quick. What do you think Biden's response would be? What do you think Biden's stance would be on Venezuela? And coming back to it, just bringing it full circle from the topic of the last conversation on Russia. I think I'm worried that Biden, as the sort of former head of Ukraine, as vice president in the Obama administration, would have a particularly antagonistic policy towards the Russian Federation. Gareth, what's your take?
Well, absolutely, I agree on the Russian side of this. I mean, his whole career since the Obama administration has been tied up with the idea of building alliances around the world that are aimed at the authoritarian regimes, Russia and China, and with Russia being the primary target. No question about that. And of course, the Ukrainian connection there has been one that has involved a lot of antagonism both ways. So I have no doubt that his policy toward Russia will be more antagonistic, and that he will have more difficulty getting away from an antagonistic relationship with Russia than the Obama administration did. There was, I think Obama himself, had an interest in trying to do one thing to reduce tension with Russia. I'm not sure that Biden is starting a presidency with the same kind of commitment at all. On the contrary, I think he's starting from a place that would make it much less likely and more difficult for him to do it. And on Venezuela, I think that he would like to have a policy that is antagonistic to Marxist type regimes. I don't think he would go as far as Trump did. I think he's perhaps observed that may not be so workable as it might have been.
15.
But more containment, Gareth. We're out of time, but possibly more containment instead of abject coup. Simply the sort of neoliberal containment policies. In any event, thank you for joining us. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We'll be back on the other side of this break with headlines. See you in a minute.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So let's get to the headlines. In the news, responding Tuesday to the surging COVID-19 pandemic, Governor Tim Walz announced dial-back measures that close bars and restaurants at 10 p.m. and restrict the size of weddings and funeral receptions, as well as indoor and outdoor gatherings. Quote, "We turned our dials forward. We're going to have to turn them back a bit today," unquote, Walz said during an afternoon news conference. State officials said the new restrictions are targeted at settings where the coronavirus is spreading. This is where we can have the biggest impact in the shortest amount of time without the massive disruption, Walz said. A trade group representing bars and restaurants said that earlier close time was unfair and would cause financial harm. Governor Tony Evers is urging but not requiring limits on public interaction on a day of record infections and deaths as Wisconsin hospitals are running out of intensive care beds. Evers on Tuesday evening delivering a statewide address and issued an executive order to make his case to the public. Please stay home. It is the first time the governor has issued a primetime platform to ask the public to begin to take the pandemic seriously 9 months into the outbreak. Wisconsin, this is serious. This crisis is urgent, Evers said in a speech from the Wisconsin State Capitol. It is not safe to go out. It is not safe to have others over. It is just not safe. And it might not be safe for a while yet. Los Angeles City Council members have requested that the city look into transforming Los Angeles Convention Center into a homeless shelter. Councilman Kieran Price, who introduced the motion, said the coronavirus pandemic has worsened problems for the city's homeless, and elected officials needed to act. Quote, "We're in a panic situation along with a pandemic situation. Folks on the streets are just suffering," he said. "Getting off the streets is important," unquote. The push comes as council members are currently under pressure from the United States District Judge David O. Carter to shelter homeless people in their districts. Carter is overseeing a lawsuit which alleges that the city and the county have not done enough to ensure homeless people are off the streets. Price's 9th district, which includes the convention center, has more than 4,800 homeless people in 2020. While there are nearly 2,700 homeless people on the streets in his district, nearly half are sheltered, a rate well above the city's average. He also argues that the convention business won't be returning for years due to the outbreak. The center has mainly stayed empty as health rules currently prohibit large-scale events. Shane, I like this idea. I like the idea better of ensuring that homeless people are not homeless. So there's that. And whether that's a jobs program, whether that's, I don't know, increasing taxes and ensure that you have a tax base for it. I don't know. I don't care. I don't think human beings need to be on the street. So I guess I like the idea of it. I think all things being equal, though, I would prefer those people to have their own homes. I guess that's the latter. But what's the difference? I mean, aren't people who are living on the street suffering in general, whether it's COVID or whether it's not COVID? It just seems like, I understand why they're saying it. It's a pandemic, so we need to take actions. But whether it's a pandemic or not, people laying on the street or sleeping on the street seems to be a health issue in general, either to the individuals who are sleeping on the street and especially to the people who are not. What do you think about that?
I think broadly, they should live in homes. I think it's probably pretty darn indignified for them to have to live all together, kind of hodgepodge like in a convention center. But like you're saying, that's marginally better than living on the streets directly. You know, the other side of this though is if you're putting them all in one space during the pandemic, isn't there a potential contagion issue there?
Yeah, isn't it worse?
For each other?
Yeah, that's
Isn't
a good
that
point.
making it worse for them?
Yeah, that's
and
a good
I mean,
point.
Again, that still might be better than the alternative in terms of the prognosis, in terms of how well that actually supports people's ability to live, be warm, be somewhat safe, that kind of thing. But yeah, you're putting them all in a big space. I could see problems with that, and
Yeah,
I could
if
see just
one
in
or two
general
get sick.
the city pushing back. Yeah, if one or two get sick, it spreads like a wildfire. And then in general, I could just see a bunch of people pushing back to the idea of taking a convention center, which admittedly is not really in use right now, but just giving that space over. I'm not even saying that's like a moral wrong. In fact, I would argue that's a good use of that kind of a space while this thing is going on. But I just see it as politically fraught. This seems like more of an idea than a reality, but we'll see what happens.
I would say pay them for their time. But yeah, I mean, if you want to get the people off the street, I agree with you, though. That's a good point. I mean, you would think there's some people who don't, who are asymptomatic. And those people, you could do temperature checks and all that stuff. I mean, unless they're saying check everybody who's coming into the shelter or who's coming into the convention center. You make a good point. But like you say, it may just be marginally better than those people being on the streets. You might have to just try to mitigate the illness. Yeah, that's a good point. It's like at a certain point, you just have bad outcomes or bad decisions. Yeah, it's just unsettling. Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick announced Tuesday that he would pay up to $1 million from his campaign account to incentivize, encourage, and reward people to come forward and report voter fraud from anywhere in the country. Quote, whistleblowers and tipsters should turn over evidence to local law enforcement. Anyone who provides information that leads to the arrest and final conviction of voter fraud will be paid a minimum of $25,000, said Patrick in a news release. I just read the thing in the Post saying that the guy who kept saying that there was voter fraud recanted. It said he signed a document attesting to such, apparently to the U.S. Postal Service. You know, they have their own investigative wing. He's saying he didn't recant. So I guess the question becomes, is there a signature or not? But at the end of the day, yeah, this guy's trying to offer money for people to, to show proof of election fraud. The British government plans to increase its power to block or to modify foreign investment in the UK on national security grounds under legislation to be introduced on Wednesday. The National Security Investment Bill will require businesses to notify the government about deals in sensitive industries, including defense, transportation, communications, and artificial intelligence. The government would have 30 days to review the transaction and impose conditions on those deemed to pose a risk to national security. The legislation, which applies to technology and intellectual property as well as corporate takeovers, follows similar moves in the United States and Australia amid increasing concerns about the investment from potentially hostile countries such as China. Quote, the UK remains one of the most attractive investment destinations in the world and we want to keep it that way, Business Security Alok Sharma said in a statement. But hostile actors should be in no doubt. There is no backdoor into the UK. You know, Shane, what's interesting about this to me is this could also be a power grab. Basically saying, hey, these industries need to communicate with us and we need to give them their instructions on how they need to behave. That also could be, we need to give them instructions on what they need to give to us in regards to information about whatever industry they're in. Yeah, this could be a backdoor to a few things. So I know they're saying there's no backdoor into the UK, but I am, it's funny. I have no issue with a law like this. It makes sense. If you are engaging in some kind of practice that may impact the government and impact the population, I can understand why the government would do it. By the same token, do I entirely trust these institutions? That's unfortunate, but I don't. It's unfortunate. Egyptian president.
No. And you can bet that the UK is going to hammer China for doing policies just like this.
Yes.
I mean, basically giving the state control over what businesses are doing. Not even control necessarily, but just a purview. That could include control. But I mean, it's a little bit fascistic. But that's just kind of what you expect governments to do at this point. I mean, one thing here is, isn't this what happens by default? I mean, on a sort of superficial level,
that's what I
you
thought.
would think that the government is keeping tabs on what key like national defense and security and intelligence companies, what they're doing. That's kind of the kind of thing they do anyway.
You would
it's
think that's
a little
their
bit
job.
confusing that this is a story. Exactly. Yes.
Like, I didn't, as I read this, I kept thinking to myself, how's this different than normal? And the UK doesn't have any laws on the books to ensure that they can do that already. And if so, then what is the point of this law? It just seems like it's a control thing, whether it's to get information on a company or to keep tabs on the way the companies are functioning. I suspect this is more intelligence, less technology stuff, but I could be wrong. Egyptian's president is meeting the Greek officials in Athens on Wednesday in his first visit to southern European nations since the two countries signed a deal demarcating maritime boundaries between them and the eastern Mediterranean. President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi was holding talks with the Greek president and prime minister in the morning, while Egyptian foreign minister Sameh Surukri will sit down with Greek counterpart Nikos Dendias in the evening. In August, Greece and Egypt signed a maritime deal demarcating the two countries' maritime boundaries and setting out respective exclusive economic zones for the exploitation of resources such as oil and gas drilling. The agreement angered Turkey, which has accused Greece of trying to grab an unfair share of resources in the eastern Mediterranean. Tensions has been high between Greece and Turkey, both NATO members, with Ankara sending a seismic research vessel into the area that Athens claims is its own continental shelf. The dispute has led both countries' warships facing off in the eastern Mediterranean and raised fears that it could lead to open conflict. It seems that Turkey is getting in a fight with everybody. Is it just me? It really does.
I mean, this is also in the regional vicinity. We're talking a lot about conflicts between Greece and Cyprus. Those are old, and obviously Turkey's deeply involved there. This is just they're a regional power, and they're sort of exercising their power. Here's what might be part of what's going on. You're hearing about it. People are reporting on this because Turkey is this sort of middleman status in the international media scene. And so you're hearing about it, unlike, for instance, you wouldn't hear in the U.S. media about the somewhat shady crap that the United States is doing. We do hear about it with other countries. Anyway, that's my take.
Erdogan has been getting a lot of news recently, so it makes sense that this stuff gets reported. And like you said, it's in their backyard. So fair enough. Bahrain's Prince Khalifa bin Salman Al Khalifa, one of the world's longest-serving prime ministers who led his Al Nation government for decades, has survived the 2011 Arab Spring protests that demanded his ouster over corruption allegations, died on Wednesday. He was 84. Bahrain's state-run news agency announced his death, saying he had been receiving treatment at the Mayo Clinic in the United States without elaborating. The Mayo Clinic did not immediately respond to a request for comment. Police Khalifa's power and wealth could be seen everywhere in the small nation off the coast of Saudi Arabia, home to the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet. His official portrait hung for decades on the walls alongside the country's rulers. He had his own private island where he met foreign dignitaries, complete with a marina and a park that had peacocks and gazelles roam its grounds. Potsdam State Office for the Environment approved another preliminary permit for the construction of Tesla's Gigafactory in Berlin. The EV automaker was allowed to continue building its casting facility for Model Y production. Continued construction work around the foundry has also been allowed. According to the local press release, approval for the recent preliminary permit were possible because it did not require any additional use of land or impact the environment further. Tesla has applied for a 6th early permit approval to start building its revolutionary paint shop and clear more of the trees in the forest. Approval for the 6th permit is still pending as it requires extensive examination. One of the world's biggest grain exporting houses signed an agreement on Wednesday to sell 45% of its stake in Abu Dhabi's sovereign wealth fund, both companies announced. The development comes as United Arab Emirates, a federation of 7 desert sheikdoms, seeks to improve its food security in the face of growing global challenges such as climate change. Louis Dreyfus Company, a family-owned commodities trading giant, reached a deal to sell an indirect equity stake in Abu Dhabi's ADQ, one of the region's largest holding companies. Louis Dreyfus has also said that it signed a long-term supply agreement with the state-owned company to sell agricultural goods to the UAE. The decision to sell a big stake in the family company marks a milestone in Louis Dreyfus' decades-long strategy, says chairperson Margaret Louis Dreyfus. ADQ hailed the agreement as a strategic move for the UAE. With its desert oil and Syrian heat, imports some 90% of its food from abroad, leaving the country acutely vulnerable to food shortages caused by erratic weather and regional instability. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So let's do this. We had right many headlines for today, so let's go immediately into a break, and we will be back with an open segment taking calls. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
And we're back, and we are taking your calls. The phone number is 202-521-1320, and the phone lines are open. And you're listening, by the way, of course, as always, the Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan on Fault Lines. By the way, you can catch us on the radio in Washington, D.C. We're on 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We are also on in Kansas City, 102.9 FM, 104.7 FM. Also, if you guys are digging what we're putting down, please do like and share our videos. You can go over to YouTube, youtube.com. Just do a quick search for Jamarl Thomas. Also do a quick search for Fault Lines Radio. Either one of those search queries will bring you to our two main video options there. There are currently our two only video options. I really want to get back up on Periscope, but there's a bit of a several-step process there that we'll talk about another time. Anyway, you go over to YouTube and do a search for Jamarl Thomas and or Fault Lines Radio. Those will take you to our channels. Jamarl's has a live video feed. They both have active chat rooms if you're into that kind of thing. And in general, if you go there, you should subscribe to those channels and like and share those videos. That'd be fantastic. Also, check us out on audio. We're on Spreaker, Stitcher, the Sputnik app, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and Apple Music. And again, our phone lines are currently open. 202-521-1320 is the number. Jamarl, I want to bring up a sort of, hey, you know what? Let's just go. Actually, we've got Tarif from New Orleans calling in. Let's go to Tarif. Tarif, you're on. What's going on?
How y'all doing, gentlemen? I have 3 comments. Joe Biden in the 1970s, when he was investigating a whole bunch of things, what the CIA was doing to people, and the FBI with COINTELPRO, MK Ultra. I noticed like the umpteenth time I brought this up, but he was on that panel, him and some other senators. It would be good if Trump can release those documents from there, where you have people put their hands on it and go through those paperwork. And also, they had a signal that came from, this is my second comment, I have another comment after this. They had a signal that came from a galaxy that they're investigating. I got to look for the article. I forgot to put it underneath your tweet for today, but I got to look for it, though. And my third comment, if somebody in the Trump administration is listening, don't let them play y'all. Release those files, release them documents like they used to tell us in the Army. Release the hounds, release the documents, baby. Because you don't want to wait till the last minute and Gina Haspel and Christopher Wray stays a crew and they use the 25th Amendment against Trump trying to say he's crazy or something else. So release those files, man. That's all I want to say.
Reese, thank you for the call.
Yeah,
Jamarl, what's your take?
Well, I was going to say, on that one, I agree with you. I do think Trump has been threatening to release files. Apparently, he had been pushing People in the administration don't want him to do it, namely some people in intelligence. But Trump wants to release it. I mean, part of the reason where Haspel is, probably going to be fired, or they're talking about firing, is because she's been at odds with Trump on some of the policies. CIA is working in the shadows. By the same token, there have been, like, for example, Ben Salman being responsible for the murder of Khashoggi. Well, Trump didn't want her to say that, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? Like, it's just, it's an odd thing. That's all. But I agree with you that he should open the books. I think he wants to. I think he's pushing to. I don't know if it's punitive. Like, I don't know if it's one of those things where it's like, I lost the race, so I kind of want to push this stuff out because I lost the race. Or if it's, just his tenor. But on that specific point about Trump releasing documents, if those documents are there, yeah, agreed. Absolutely agree. Including the alien bodies. I want to see those too. I want you to bring the rocket ship. I want you to say, here's the ship, here's the bodies, I'm Trump, and cement his record in for all times for disclosing. That's what I want.
That would be fantastic.
That would be shocking, man.
That would be a lot of people's dream come true. And that would be, in some sense, the full culmination of what Trump represented as a president, as this Kantian historical force. Anyway, no, I'm kind of joking about that. We've got another caller on the line. We're taking calls, 202-521-1320. Malik, calling in from D.C. You're on the line, Malik. What's going on?
Hey there. Good morning, fellas. Well, I've come to some conclusions lately, just as a human being and as a black man in America, and I would definitely want to hear Jamal's thoughts on this, but myself personally, and I think a lot of black men feel this way. I've never felt safe in America. But I definitely lately, as a black man and as a black person as in general, feel like this is not my country, and that it's become it's not just become a dangerous place for black people, but it's become a place where the end of our story is not going to be pleasant here. And I'm definitely seeking to exit. But I did want to ask a question of both you guys, and I'll get off the line. Do you think that you'll ever may regret having? I wouldn't say that you guys are co-signing this policy around COVID overtly, but do you think you will ever get to a point where you might look back on this and you may say, "Wow, that was a terrible, terrible turn." For humanity and particularly for people in this country. Do you think you'll ever get to that point?
I'm already there.
No.
I mean, you sort of, if you could stay on the line, I'm curious about what you mean by regret. I don't think this has been good for humanity at all. Yeah, I don't think that the pandemic, and I especially don't think that the response to the pandemic has been good. But frankly, I don't see what the alternative is. You talk about herd immunity in the countries where they've tried that strategy, out in Sweden, for instance. Right now, the lines are a bit further down. But at least at first, they saw a lot more deaths than their neighboring countries. And I'm worried that if we had tried that same strategy, instead of having 230,000 dead, we'd have 700,000 dead right now. So that's the thing. We don't have sliding doors into the other alternative history here. But frankly, I'm worried that the response to it is even worse. I'm worried that increasing government powers in this way. I'm worried that destroying the middle class, which this appears to be doing, putting people in a position of perpetual, or at least long-term dependence. Frankly, on the government, I don't think that that's good for anybody. I'd rather that we never had this, that we were prepared to handle this from the beginning, before it happened. We had plenty of time to prepare for this kind of a virus to spread, and that we had just nipped it in the bud. And we, in that parallel universe, none of this would have happened. That's what I would have preferred. But if wishes were fishes, I'd be lost in the sea.
Yeah, I know, right?
Jamarl, what's your take?
If ifs and ands were pots and pans, the world would be a kitchen. Look. Whether it's good or not, it's almost secondary to the fact that pandemics happen. They just are. And the question becomes, what would have been the death toll, and would there have always been some death toll? Maybe not the number that we are today. I strongly suspect that regardless of who the president was, there was always going to be some deaths. The question becomes, how does the country handle it, and could the response have been better? Yes, I think the response could have been better. No, I'm not going to look back on it and fret over being stuck in the house for a bit of time. I will look back on it and fret that so many people were destroyed, that the country didn't seem to care about those people that were destroyed. They didn't care about the small businesses that were being destroyed. None of those things. And in fact, millionaires in Congress were more concerned that somebody who was dirt poor was getting a couple of $100 extra a month. I mean, put that in perspective. And mind you, that was a thing that was literally keeping the economy afloat over that time period, because those people were able to get a little bit extra money, or at the very least keep themselves intact. Now, I am concerned about the evictions. I'm concerned about the people who are going to be adversely affected in the next generation, meaning this doesn't just stop with one generation. This will perpetuate itself from a family line. I'm concerned about the people who are not going to be able to make ends meet, who might have lost family members. Yeah, I'm concerned all the way through, especially the reaction to it. But my concern is not because people are staying in the house. Like, if you think back, the Spanish flu was far, far worse. Like, you're talking about like hundreds of millions of people dying from Spanish flu. Look, it's bad. It sucks. I had to go once 40 days without eating. And so, you know, because being in a hospital and everything else, they start feeding you lipids and whatnot. I guess the point is, there are people who have to live dramatically bad lives, and far worse than putting on a mask, and far worse than taking these minor precautions. It lasts. It's life. I understand that we sanitize our world to such a degree where it's like everything that happens tomorrow is already known. But I don't know, you know, but that's not reality per se. This virus is, and you just have to accommodate it. I mean, I don't, it's like wringing your hands is one thing, but, you know, but yeah, does that mean people won't try to take advantage? Yes, people will try to take advantage. All of those things are true at once. So, yeah, it's not that I love it. Oh, as for feeling unsafe or not feeling that this is my country. Look, I was born here. And, you know, I don't necessarily feel safe around cops. I think cops are dangerous. I do think there is, but I don't walk around feeling unsafe, if that makes sense. That's not my my typical tenor, my typical disposition. But I do understand where you're coming from with that. Cops, yeah, I find cops to be dangerous in general. But from that standpoint, in general, walking around society, no, I don't feel entirely unsafe. I do feel like there is a dramatic difference between the politics of this country versus my own. And that creates an odd distinction between what it seems like many of the people in the country are fed media-wise versus the way I vibrate. And so in that sense, if that's what you mean when you say it feels like there's this distinction between who you are versus who the country is, and it feels like you're out the same track. If that's what you mean, then yeah, I get where you're coming from on that. But I don't typically walk around feeling unsafe. Cops, yes, I consider cops extraordinarily dangerous. But under normal circumstances, no, I don't have this unsafe feeling. And I do understand where you're coming from when you're saying it feels like this country is not, like you're not vibing. What do you think, Shane? Is this just this thing of the country feeling like it's going in the wrong direction? Or is there something more, something a bit deeper to it than that?
I don't know. I mean, I think he was speaking largely as a Black American.
No. I just mean from when people are asked and they would say like, do you think the country is moving in the wrong direction? And the number, it seemed to always be yes. But there seem to be higher points than others. I mean, is it really just moving in the wrong direction?
I'm worried that the country is not
something
moving.
Deeper to that? I mean, it feels like there's something deeper to that.
I'm concerned that we're not moving very much at all. I'm concerned that we as a society are politically stagnant. We're becoming more and more technologically stagnant. Yeah, it's not that we're on some like, yes, our political system is breaking down, and we're sort of seeing that play out as more and more money gets thrown at doing less and less. But I would argue on a deeper level, again, technologically, it's been a while since we've had this sort of focused conversation, but I keep coming back to that because that is sort of the groundwork of what it's possible for human beings to do, is what technology you have access to and who that technology is afforded to in your society, how widely it's distributed, and what kinds of technologies. I mean, I'll put it like this. which is more advantageous to asymmetry in power, the nuclear bomb or the Winchester rifle, where with the advent of very cheap firearms, you basically democratize the access to violence. And with the advent of nuclear weaponry, you monopolized violence. You made it so that only a certain number of very large states would be able to have ultimate control over the fates of millions of lives. And I'm not saying that violence is a good thing, au contraire. What I'm pointing out here is that simple technological advances that are made, simple technological advances have outsized impacts on what shape power takes in the world. And frankly, I think that we've been stuck in this sort of nuclear nap thing for too long now. We've been stuck in this stasis for like 70 years. And I'd rather be stuck in that stasis than dead, to be clear, which, a lot of other sliding doors of this universe where we could have just died due to a worldwide nuclear war. But frankly, on that ground level, I think we need more progress. And I think that the better technologies need to be more widely distributed. I mean, imagine like going into a break here, but imagine a world in which farming was cheap and automated and holistic and was good for the ecosystem, and more people had access to land, and we were kind of just doing our own thing for the most part. Again, that's like this sort of utopian pastoral ideal thing that I have, and it's admittedly a bit parochial, but I would much rather live in that world than this one, and frankly, that's a technological world. That's a world that's dependent on the widespread use of new technologies that we have yet to create.
There's no such
I think we
thing
need
as
to get
utopia.
back towards like...
There's no such thing as...
No.
What I mean by that is you always move. I'm saying that idea is not utopian. That's just a good idea. That's the difference.
Well, Thomas More, with the book Utopia, literally made it so that there's no such thing as utopia. He spelled it with a U at the beginning, which is a place that isn't possible. But usually, I mean, it's true. No, it's true. But prior to that...
No, what I mean is like...
It would have been EU. It would have been EU-utopia. Anyway, this is a weird etymological distinction. A good place. It would have been a good place to live. And so there's this weird contradiction built into the core of how we understand what a better society looks like. Anyway, We're pushing up over the edge of a break here. We should go into it. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We will be back on the other side with Margaret Kimberly. Back in a minute, folks. Fault Lines.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. And we are joined by Margaret Kimberly. She is a senior columnist and editor for Black Agenda Report and the author of Prejudential, Black America and the Presidents. And by the way, you can follow her on Twitter at Freedom Ride Blog and check out her work at blackagendareport.com. Margaret, thank you for being with us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing fine. Thanks.
Hey, thank you for being with us. All right, I'm going to start it off right here. You have an article up over on your website, again, blackagendareport.com. This is published a couple of days ago. Freedom Writer, Black people lose in 2020. I'm just going to read the first sentence from this article. Black people will get nothing from a Joe Biden administration except fiscal austerity and the precarity that comes with it. Why do you say that? I'll just start off right there. I'm going to ask a sort of dummy question just to lead us in. Why do you say that, Margaret?
Because that's all the system is offering to us. The Democrats are the party of austerity just as much as Republicans are. It's a bipartisan project. And I think it's important to stay up front and to try to focus on the reality of what it means when we have Democrats in office instead of Republicans. I understand why Black people want to keep Republicans out of office, but having a Democrat in does not change anything for the better for the great masses of us unless we first of all realize that we're not getting a change, and unless we actively make consistent and clear demands.
Margaret, welcome to the show. I always enjoy it when you come on, so thank you for coming on. I don't understand. Clyburn, King of Black Whisper, basically made the point that blacks should shut up about this notion of being taken advantage of, or about losing in 2020, as you're saying, because Kamala Harris was made vice president. I mean, what do you have to say to that? I mean, shouldn't black folks be satisfied with Kamala Harris as being vice president, as being, the bearer of all their dreams and wishes?
Well, Clyburn is a company guy. I mean, that's all he is. He's no kingmaker or anything. He would be a kingmaker if he acted independently, but he's not an independent actor. He's a part of the Democratic Party establishment. And his job in presidential elections is to anoint whomever the establishment wants to have the nomination. And that's all he did this year.
Well, it goes beyond that. Just to interrupt for 1 second. Also, to dodge on issues of identity. Like, I don't know if you heard his statement the other day. He made the point of saying he brought up John Lewis, dragged John Lewis from the grave, and saying that him and John Lewis were as progressive as anybody, and people talk about this progressive stuff, meaning basically the questions about economics, the questions about like healthcare and those type of things that would actually matter to the African American community get pushed off the table with a cover on issues of identity. And that's exactly what he's there for. And that's exactly what he did the other day.
Oh, sure it is. And it's unfortunately it works too well. It's one of the things that I dread about Biden being in office instead of Trump is that these scoundrels return. And yes, the Clyburn and others who are lauded by everybody else, I'm not impressed because, as I said before, they do the bidding of the people whose interests are diametrically opposed to ours. And I did use this quote in my Wednesday's Black Agenda Report Day. So at some point this morning, people can see that I quoted him saying he and John Lewis talking about defund the police was as bad as burn, baby, burn. And that's why the movement in the 60s failed, not because of COINTELPRO or anything like that. So these are people who pimp off of our history to get buy-in for people who don't mean us, who aren't any good for us. Clyburn, I always point this out when I write anything about him. Among other things, he's one of the biggest recipients of money from Big Pharma. More than $1 million. He gets hundreds of thousands of dollars from them. And that tells me all I need to know. And it tells you that this is not a person who is interested in our welfare, who is interested in the welfare of those people who fund him, just like the rest of the political leadership.
With the Clyburns of the world and this focus on identity, I tend to try to make the point to people, and like you said, blacks losing this because the focus on identity is not being done in a way of saying there was a disproportionate share of African Americans that died because of COVID, so let's do something about healthcare. That's not what's being done. Like, that's not the logic. No. That's not the argument that these guys make. These guys make arguments entirely around this idea of race, as if they can somehow sever issues of race and identity away from issues of class. They almost try to use it interchangeable. I mean, even when they talk about King, they talk about King in the context of he was a dreamer and he was a racial justice person, missing the point that the guy was a socialist and a radical that got getting thrown in jail for pushing back against a hostile system.
Yeah, he was also he of course he was a radical, but they're not going to point out those things about him or anybody else. And they also don't point out he was vilified when he was alive. That's the other thing I find interesting. But So people who are vilified now while they're still alive, who we should be paying attention to, frankly. But people like him, this Black misleadership class, as we call them in Black Agenda Report, they emerged in the wake of the movement. They owe their position now to the people who suffered a lot more than they did. They were created to give the system cover. And that's exactly what he does in being this point person for the rigging of the primary in favor of Joe Biden. And indeed, it was rigged successfully this time. So we have to keep all of these things in mind. And we have to be like the people of that time. You know, everybody wants to talk about the civil rights movement, but the people of that era did not treat politicians and political parties as if they were their friends. They made demands knowing the system did not want to meet them. And that is what we cannot forget and what we have to keep doing.
But see,
Margaret, in the last, go ahead, Jamarl.
No.
Sure. Well, yeah, in the last segment, we had a caller, Malik, who called in and was said a couple of things. He turned to COVID, and we kind of started talking about that. But he also addressed a question, I believe, primarily at Jamarl. And I don't want to misrepresent what he said, but I'm going to try to sort of briefly paraphrase it. He was basically saying he does not feel, he's speaking as a Black American, that America represents him, that it can represent him. He's planning on moving pretty soon. I've seen this not just from Black people, but under Trump specifically, from a lot of people. But I think it has obviously a particularly special resonance for Black Americans. I'm just curious, what is your take on that? Do you see that changing? It's pretty obvious where that's come from. Historically, America has been built on the work done by Black people and has primarily rewarded white people and other races for the work done by Black people. So I can just right off the bat see that. But I'm curious, looking at that from a sort of grand historical perspective, what do you think about that? What's your take, Margaret?
Well, I think it's a response. It's a response to racism experienced by Black people. It's also a response to the fact that we are living in a failed state, and America works less and less well for the majority of people. We have before COVID, half of all American workers low income, millions of people without health insurance, people who have health insurance but go broke if they get sick. The rising gig economy, the austerity and the precarity that comes with it that is promoted endlessly by both political parties. All of these things have made life less and less tenable in this country, and people don't see any change, and they're smart to see this. What are we going to get with Biden? We already heard a couple of months ago they tried to walk it back, but his successor in the Senate and the leader of his transition team, his successor in Delaware, said, well, the cupboard's going to be bare in January. We're not going to be able to do much. So they're already preparing us, telling us they're not going to do what needs to be done. Billions, trillions of federal dollars need to be spent to make people whole, to make businesses whole in the wake of COVID. But they're telling us that's not going to happen. And they're going to use the Republican control of the Senate as an excuse to do as little as they possibly can. So any metric that you use to determine what the quality of life in this country is dropping. It's terrible. The fact that that the United States suffered disproportionately from COVID tells you everything you need to know. And I don't believe it's just Trump. Yes, Trump is uniquely incompetent in putting his son-in-law and Mike Pence in charge. None of those things were helpful. But this is a systemic issue, and people see that, and they have concluded that it isn't going to change. And I believe all of those factors come into play when people express a desire to just get out and go somewhere else.
Margaret, we've got to go into a break right here. We're joined by Margaret Kimberly. She is an senior columnist and editor for Black Agenda Report and the author of Presidential Black America and the Presidents. And you can follow her on Twitter at Freedom Ride Blog. And again, you can check her work out at blackagendareport.com. We will be back with Margaret in just a minute on the other side of this break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and our guest, Margaret Kimberly, senior columnist and editor for Black Agenda Report and author of Presidential Black America and the Presidents. Margaret, in our last segment, you were responding to a question by Jamarl. You were talking about Black leadership and how historically people who were vilified are sanctified after they're dead. And it's sort of used to brush under the rug the harsh treatment of a lot of people who are fighting for, in a lot of cases, noble causes. I'm curious, towards the end of that, you said, in the process, we're ignoring current leaders who are doing good work. We're sort of brushing under the rug people who are still alive, who are still potent in that aspect. Who are you talking about there? Can you just give us some names, drop some names?
Well, I would say the work we do at Black Agenda Report, myself, Glenn Ford, Ajamu Baraka, and everyone on our team. It's always dangerous when you start naming people. Our whole team, Danny Haifong and Ann Garrison and others. Black Alliance for Peace in particular is taking a lead role right now in resurrecting this the radicalism of Black politics that existed for decades, and that was killed off by this creation of this Black political class, by the fact that a handful of Black people were given positions of prominence and gave cover to the entire system. You have to look, they're not people who get attention from the corporate media, but if you follow the folks that I just talked about, you will discover who they are. It isn't necessary for people to have some high position to be effective. And I would argue that when you're talking about a kind of new education, political education, and movement building and organizing, you are not going to be talking about anybody that anyone has heard of. But I would say in general, you have to oppose almost everything they do. You can't go wrong if you oppose Joe Biden, who is going to be, after some bumps in the road with Trump throwing bombs as he goes out the door, but I'm sure he is going to be president and Kamala Harris will be vice president. You cannot lionize these people. You cannot. It's very tempting for those who, most people are not political thinkers, and I'm not trying to make fun of anyone. Most people depend on the media, and their political activity amounts to voting only. So when they see Kamala Harris come out on stage, and apparently she wore a white suit and she was holding her niece's hand and something else and tugging at the heartstrings and all of that stuff, you have to keep your head, and you can't be sentimental about people who have control over our lives and have the ability to change our lives for the better. So we can't see them as friends, and we cannot see as friends those people who work with them.
I've made the point that Black Lives Matter is about to be erased, that it was fine and good when it was Trump. You could paint it out on the plaza. You can pull these theatrics. Nancy Pelosi can get on her knee. Joe Biden can give a knee. All these people can give knees, and everybody else. But that is not going to be a factor that is going to be out there separate from Biden. And I have a hard time believing that a lot of the focus is lavished on it in the way that the focus was lavished on it under Trump and used as a weapon against Trump. I think from the standpoint of Biden, he wants those people in his fold or for them to be ignored. And I think that's kind of going to be what's going to end up happening. You made the point that blacks lose in 2020, and I agree with you. And I think part of that is because, like you said, you get a Kamala Harris who are walking around in tennis shoes, and people are like, oh God, she's wearing tennis shoes. It's like, okay, she's wearing tennis shoes. What about healthcare? Are we going to get healthcare? Then I don't care about the tennis shoes. Like, it really need to be boiled down to policy. What's the solution? Should African Americans go with this notion of starting their own politics, meaning their own political party or their own political organization? And are the issues that pertain to African Americans dramatically different from issues that pertain to anybody else as human beings in the country? And what would that look like from a standpoint of a difference in politics?
Well, our history is different from anyone else's. I think what it would look like is showing opposition, or at the very least, not going along with the as you called it, the theatrics, and understanding who these people are and that they do not represent your interests. The most important thing is for us to advocate for our interests. And when they tell you that you can't have Medicare for all, or Biden's, we can forgive student loan debt if you went to a public college and if your parents made X amount, then we can. Otherwise, we can't. That's all nonsense. They can do anything they want. We find that out when they have a space force or give money to Ukraine or do any number of things all around the world. They can do anything they want to do for us. And I think people have to make themselves knowledgeable, and that we have to act in our interest and do it unceasingly. What is it we need? What would help us? And not accept these people and not allow them to scare you that, you had to go along with Joe Biden because if you didn't, it meant you liked Trump. It's just the opposite. You withhold your support. You withhold your endorsement. That should have happened even before the primaries began. There should have been a line in the sand. These are the things we need before we support anyone. So that is what I think it would look like, supporting people for office. And this is difficult to do. Money plays such a role. But I think that people still have that power not to have these, let's just talk about Congress, for example, where it takes so much money to run for office. And that makes everyone, makes them susceptible to pressure, and they're bought before they even get started. So those are the kinds of things that we have to begin doing in order to get ourselves out of this situation where we're trapped in the duopoly.
Yeah, I agree with you. And unfortunately, the left cannot get them to that point. Like, I've been on this little, my show, and even on Fault Lines, where I've been tooting about this notion of this need for African Americans, the left, and for people to push policy, to ignore the party stuff. I mean, honestly, I agree with you. There should have been a flood of people outside of the party structure at this point. I think the last poll they did, I think 72% of the public backed Medicare for all. And Joe Biden spent the election running around talking about, I'd veto a policy if it was passed by the House and the Senate. Like, think of how wild that is. And then you still get people who will go out there and advocate for Joe Biden and be dancing in the streets when the guy gets elected. And you point out the overwhelming majority of you want health care. This guy's basically saying, I am not going to do that. And saying this at a time where Obamacare might get struck down, legitimately might get struck down. It's astonishing. I mean, is it just over the past 40 years, people have been so beaten down that they don't, like, the incrementalism is the only thing that they know?
Yeah, it is. People are beaten down. That's an excellent description. That is where people are. And the damage of Trump being in office only made things worse, because you had this man who was in some ways an outlier, who took everything his predecessors had done to a further degree. So he's not the first one to want a wall on the Mexican border, by the way, but he's the first one to separate families and to have that as a policy. And by ratcheting up that level of to an extreme level and going outside the boundaries of what had been conventional politics, that of course created so much more anxiety for people. So it's easy and then of course they rig the system and they make sure that anyone who speaks to your interest is not going to get the nomination. They make sure that their Democrats' first campaign was against Bernie Sanders, and that means against progressives in the Democratic Party. So then they tell you, well, see, you guys lost again. Of course, they could win if they were left alone and not propagandized against the way Sanders was earlier this year. So that's how they do it. Trump actually was a dream for them because he kept people corralled into the Democratic Party establishment. Even it was so bad that, for example, here in New York, a so-called safe state where Biden was never in danger, I know people who used to say, I live in the safe state, I'm not going to have to vote for the Democrat. This year, they were saying, I feel like we have to defeat Trump. We have to run up the score against him. He must be humiliated. I know my vote doesn't count in the Electoral College, but I'm still going to vote for Biden. It's that kind of mentality, which was created by Trump, which made that even worse. But we can't fall for that, and we have to keep our heads and really be clear about the facts and not allow ourselves to be swayed by emotion.
Margaret, last couple of minutes here. I was gonna take it in a kind of different direction, Jamarl. If you wanted to keep it in the same vein, you can.
No.
Absolutely do that.
Go for it.
So thank you. Margaret, a couple minutes ago, you were talking about how specifically black voters, but this could apply just generally to people on the left, shouldn't vote for the Democrats. Actually, that's a misrepresentation. What you were saying was they should hold them to a higher standard. They should lay out, this is what we want. These are the policies we want, and then abstain from voting if the Democrats don't do that, which frankly, they wouldn't. Now, over the course of a couple of election cycles, if the Democrats keep losing, the assumption here is that they're going to have to change their policies within the left right now, whether it's the progressives or the liberals, whatever cohort of the left you're going to label there. There's constant infighting over that exact topic because, of course, every election, the other side seems evil compared to your side. And it's always this sort of choice of lesser of two evils, and things keep getting sort of hemmed in that way. Where does this go in the long run? And I mean, specifically, if you're going to abstain from voting, that's a sort of negative move in the sense that you are refraining from doing something. From your perspective, what are the positive moves in the sense of what could people do to either specifically reform the Democratic Party from the inside out? This could be electing local candidates, or to create a potential third party or alternative party that could displace the Democrat Party in the long run. Like, where is the strategic thinking that you see, or that you think other people might see or might look up to? Who is doing that kind of thinking? Frankly, I'm just trying to figure out who I should be paying attention to here, and what ideas seem exciting. Margaret, what's your take?
Well, I think the first thing people have to do is realize you can't reform the Democratic Party. They don't want to be reformed. Their goal is to crush anybody who is outside the bounds of their narrative, outside the bounds of the neoliberal and imperialist structure. So you can't reform them. It cannot be done. It is not going to happen. Now, what do you do after that? That's a big question. I already made the move. I'm a member of the Green Party. We have a lot of rebuilding to do. That's my concern. The Democrats responded to 2016 by knocking Greens off the ballot in multiple states. In New York, they raised the threshold for the number of votes that must be received in order to have a ballot line, and Greens aren't even on the ballot in New York. So we are up against it, but I
go for a third party. We're basically out of time, but I mean, yeah, from what you're saying, you can't reform the DNC. You've got to go to some other choice. And for you, it's the Greens. And for me, it's probably the Greens over the Libertarians, too. Those are really the two viable third parties I see, and I'd probably side with the Greens there. In any event, Margaret, thank you for joining us. Margaret Kimberly is a senior columnist and editor for Black Agenda Report and the author of Presidential Black America and the Presidents. We'll be back in just a minute with headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
And we're live, coming to you from across the divided states of America. In our third and last hour this morning, we are the most disruptive show covering news and events, not just in America, but around the globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Quick note here. Today is not just Veterans Day, and thank you, veterans. You know, complicated conversation to have. Of course, we've had that conversation with Danny Scherzen. If you're opposed to the United States wars and war in general, what relationship are you supposed to have? But nevertheless, thank you, veterans. And then secondarily, today is, I guess, Make-A-Wish Day. It's 11/11. It's November 11th. So now is the time. If there are any significant changes you want to make, like for instance, saving the world by averting a climate catastrophe and preventing the widespread proliferation of nuclear weapons somehow miraculously, I think today is the day to do that. Anyway, without further ado, I think it's time for headlines in the news this morning. First up, COVID political news. Responding Tuesday to the surging COVID-19 pandemic, Governor Tim Walz announced dial-back measures that close bars and restaurants at 10 p.m. and restrict the sizes of weddings and funeral receptions, as well as indoor and outdoor gatherings. Quote, we turned our dials forward. We are going to have to turn them back a bit today, Walz said during an afternoon news conference. State officials said the new restrictions are targeted to settings where the new coronavirus is spreading. This, by the way, Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota. I'm going to continue the quote here. This is where we can have the biggest impact in the shortest amount of time without the massive disruption, end quote. A trade group representing bars and restaurants said the earlier closing time was unfair and would cause financial harm. Meanwhile, Governor Tony Evers is urging but not requiring limits on public interaction on a day of record infections and deaths, and as Wisconsin hospitals are running out of intensive care beds, sort of taking the Sweden tactic there, urging but not requiring. That does remind one of what Sweden has done historically. Evers on Tuesday evening delivered a statewide address and issued an executive order to make his case to the public. Please stay home. That's the case he's making. It is the first time the governor has used a primetime platform to ask the public to begin to take the pandemic seriously 9 months into the outbreak. I quote here, Wisconsin, this is serious. The crisis is urgent. It's not safe to go out. It's not safe to have others over. It's just not safe. And it might not be safe for a while yet, quote, end quote. Of course, a while yet is a pretty ambiguous phrase to use there. Who knows how long it's going to be? We're what, 9 months into it at this point? 10 months? No, more like 8 months into it at this point since March. In any event, we're a ways into it. We're 2/3 of a year into a virus and into a lockdown and into broadly a state of perpetual suspense and low-grade hysteria. Yeah, man. I mean, again, I have a kind of weird, slightly nuanced take on this stuff, which is I'm opposed to. I'm not necessarily opposed to the lockdowns, because who knows how much worse it would have been. 230 some odd thousand deaths at this point. I believe around 240,000 deaths in the U.S. alone, over 1 million deaths globally. Who knows how much worse it would have been if governments hadn't implemented the lockdowns. On the other hand, causing a long-term increase in political power in ways that I'm very much afraid of, seriously damaging the economy, gutting the middle class, et cetera. Anyway, Jamarl, we've gone back and forth on this over the years. Any sort of interim remarks here? What do you think about these moves? What do you think about just the idea of reimposing lockdowns in general?
If you broke your ankle, well, let's say maybe you didn't break your ankle. Let's say you got ill. Let's say you got chickenpox, or let's say you got some kind of virus, and you needed to be hospitalized. Being in the hospital is traumatic. It makes you more susceptible to some kind of, what is it? They call it iatrogenic disease. That might be the wrong word for it, but basically disease that are born in the hospital itself.
Iatrogenic.
That's
exactly.
it, right.
Exactly.
So there are all sorts of consequences. The fact that you're laid up in the bed itself, the depression that's associated with it. During COVID, you don't have the ability to deal with family members, so you're stuck to the whims of these, strangers. Like, there's all sorts of things that go along with being in the hospital that are negative. By the same token, you're not there because you want to be there. You're there because something went wrong. And all of those other negative consequences just are the best case scenario in trying to deal with a horrible outcome. Meaning, as you get further and further down a particular path, your decision space narrows. And so it's like your realm of decisions get constrained. It's not that it's great. So, it's not that I love the lockdowns. I think the lockdowns are horrendous. It grates on you, especially me, because I'm stuck in this house for the past X number, year or so. But we need to make a difference between something that may have a benefit or even something of a necessity, as opposed to the consequences of not inaction. That's my only point. It's not that I love lockdowns. It's not that I love wearing masks. I don't like any of this stuff. It's just, in my life, I've had to do plenty of things that I didn't necessarily like to do for all sorts of reasons, especially around the issues of health. And so for me, I acquiesce to this a little bit more, thinking it's temporary. That's the way I see it. It's not that I love it. I don't like the power grab. I don't like the, I don't like any of this stuff. But it's not what I like. That has nothing to do with it. I mean, if there's a better option, I'm all ears. But I don't know what that better option is. And we're talking about states like New York that are densely packed, or San Francisco. And these states would have had far more deaths. I mean, they had like 20, 30,000 deaths in New York. Cuomo somehow gets a pat on the back for getting this many people killed. But you get my point. Like, it's not that I love it. I just don't know another option for it.
I hear you. Yeah, it's complicated on pretty much every end. In any event, we do have a lot more headlines to get into. Los Angeles City Council members have requested that the city look into transforming the LA Convention Center into a homeless shelter. Councilman Curran Price, who introduced the motion, said that the coronavirus pandemic had worsened problems for the city's homeless and that elected officials needed to act. Quote, "We're in a panic situation along with a pandemic situation. Folks on the street are just suffering. Getting people off the street is important." End quote. Push comes as the council members are currently under pressure from U.S. District Judge David O. Carter to shelter homeless people in their districts. Carter is overseeing a lawsuit which alleges that the city and county have not done enough to get homeless people off the streets. Price's 9th district, which includes the convention center, has more than 4,800 homeless people in 2020, while there are nearly 2,700 homeless on the streets in his district. Nearly half are sheltered. That's a rate well above the city's average. He also argues that the convention business won't be returning for years due to the outbreak. The center has mainly stayed empty as health rules currently prohibit large-scale events there. And again, I just want to point this out. This is, he's saying, I'm going to quote directly from him, "We're in a panic situation along with a pandemic situation," quote, end quote. Wouldn't it be harmful? Like, wouldn't you increase the spread of COVID among the homeless population by moving them all into one place, like the convention center? Like, I mean, that's just the first thing that sort of jumps out at me when I look at this proposal is if you're dealing with a crisis having to do with the viral disease, an infectious disease, and you put everybody in one place, and if a couple of people get sick, which they're liable to, based on how fast it's spreading these days, and it just circulates widely among the population. Frankly, I can't help but think that he would have forethought that. I think he would have thought that out too, and that he just wants to do this because it's a good political move, and frankly, because it probably is good for homeless folks to have somewhere warm to sleep, and somewhere marginally safer than the streets to sleep. I don't know, Jamarl. We were talking about this earlier. What's your take?
I don't hate this, providing you can test the people who are there. like I said, all things being equal, I think it is abominable that we allow homelessness at all. If it is indeed the government's job to provide for the general welfare, then just at the very basic, not having people laying on the street is probably a good way to start. I also don't know if it's more dangerous for somebody to be on the street with COVID as opposed to being off, if that makes sense. And so if there's some kind of mechanism to test, then I don't really have an issue with it. But I take your point. It's a really good point. I mean, if you put all of these people in a convention center, wouldn't that pack people closer together? And wouldn't that packing people closer together create a higher propensity for those people to get ill? I don't know the answer to that. So I would imagine testing has to be a major part of this if they're going to do it.
Yeah, I would think so. And probably some pop-up shelters inside would help a bit. But even then, if you're going to be in a single enclosed space, no matter how many makeshift tents or shelters you set up within that space, you're going to have circulation of highly infectious disease. Anyway, I don't mean to nitpick here. I understand people are trying. In other news, Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick announced Tuesday that he would pay up to $1 million from his campaign account to incentivize, encourage, and reward people to come forward and report voter fraud from anywhere in the country. Quote, whistleblowers and tipsters should turn over their evidence to local law enforcement. Anyone who provides information that leads to an arrest and final conviction of voter fraud will be paid a minimum of $25,000. End quote. That's coming from Patrick in a news release. That's what? I mean, I'm just going to point this out. That's up to 40 whistleblowers. That's a hard cap of 40 whistleblowers. If he's giving out $1 million and he's giving $25,000 minimum per person, I would think you would need more than that. I'm just going to point this out. I would think that it would be more advantageous for him to offer a smaller dollar amount per person or to offer a larger total reward, because even 40 different cases of people coming forward, many of those are going to be contested. Every one of those is going to be contested by various election authorities, by the USPS, by whomever, whichever relevant party. That's thing one. And then thing two is that's only 40 people in general. So, whether some of those people are legitimately fraudulent or whatever the case may be, I get what he's doing. I mean, he's trying to, it's not just a political move on his part. There might be some genuine attempt here to actually get evidence out there, but it's just too little to have much of a practical impact.
Like you said, if it's unless each of those people are showing 25,000 ballots a pop, it can't just be I saw one ballot change. It can't be that. I mean, we're talking about thousands of votes that we're talking about need to be changed for Trump to win this. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the thing. All right. Other news here. The British government plans to increase its power to block or modify foreign investment in the UK on national security grounds under legislation to be introduced today. The National Security and Investment Bill would require businesses to notify the government about deals in sensitive industries. Those industries include defense, transportation, communications, and artificial intelligence. The first and the last, defense and artificial intelligence, those seem the most relevant here. Transportation and communications, sure. But the first and the last are a bit those are the national security establishment's interests, to put it simply. The government, although communications falls under that too, but I would argue less so. The government will then have 30 days to review the transactions and impose conditions on those deemed to pose a risk to national security. The legislation, which applies to technology and intellectual property, as well as corporate takeovers, follows similar moves by the U.S. and Australia amid increasing concern about investment from potentially hostile countries such as China. The UK remains one of the most attractive investment destinations in the world, and we want to keep it that way. That last sentence is a quote from Business Secretary Alok Sharma, saying this in a statement. But hostile actors should be in no doubt, quote unquote. There is no backdoor into the UK. Again, Alok Sharma. And with that, you know what? I'll throw in a few more stories here. We're kind of running short on time. In Egypt's president is meeting with Greek officials in Greece, in Athens on Wednesday, in his first visit to the southern European nation since the two countries signed a deal demarcating maritime boundaries between them in the Eastern Mediterranean. President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi was holding talks with the Greek president and prime minister in the morning, while Egyptian foreign minister Sameh Shoukry will sit down with Greek counterpart Nikos Dendias in the evening. In August, Greece and Egypt signed a maritime deal demarcating the two countries' maritime boundaries and setting out respective exclusive economic zones for the exploitation of resources such as oil and gas drilling. The agreement angered Turkey, which has accused Greece of trying to grab an unfair share of resources in the Eastern Mediterranean. Tension has been high between Greece and Turkey, both NATO members, with Ankara sending a seismic research vessel into areas that Athens claims is over its own continental shelf. Pardon me, a little bit of a confusing sentence there. The dispute has led to both countries' warships facing off in the eastern Mediterranean and has raised fears it could lead to open conflict. Again, Turkey getting involved, as you're saying, but of course, Turkey and Greece have had this conflict, which I'm just going to point out. Guests on this show have said that might be largely theatrical. We'll see, I mean, there are real economic interests at stake here in terms of access to oil, but it's also a potentially political theater for Erdogan in Turkey and in Greece as well. Each sort of saber rattling as a show of force for their constituencies at home. In any event, I'm going to close it here. Those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we are going into a break. We'll be back in a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and myself, Shane Stranahan. We'll be back in just a minute. See you on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now, the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in D.C. If you guys are in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming us on, definitely give us a like and definitely share that content. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Joining us now, however, is Nefta Freeman, a policy analyst with the Institute of Policy Studies, member of the Coordinating Committee on the Black Alliance for Peace, and a radio talk show host and producer. I apologize.
Nefta.
Nefta.
That's okay. Everybody does it.
That's a tough one. Okay, can you pronounce it again for me? Nefta.
Nefta. It helps to remember Netflix. Nefta.
I say, okay, Nefta. Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
I don't know what I was going on. That's okay.
Totally
Everybody does that.
So thank you for coming on to the show. I appreciate you coming on, especially for this particular topic, because I am fascinated by the policy that is taking place in Africa, especially what is going on in regards to in Ethiopia. The gentleman who was came into office came in under this kind of wave of peace. I mean, basically, if I remember correctly, when I was traveling at the time, he was making peace with Eritrea, if I'm not mistaken. They were in a conflict over a period of time. I could be, and please correct me if I'm remembering this incorrectly. Recently, there's been a conflict dealing with Tigray, and he sent military forces, meaning the leader of, I can't think of the gentleman's name right now, but he sent forces to Tigray, basically saying that this situation has gotten to the point where there's nothing else that can be done. This is not what I wanted to do, but this is what I needed to do based upon the environment on the ground itself. Can you explain what is taking place? I mean, how did this gentleman who came in under this idea of peace ends up in this kind of military conflict at home?
Wow. Okay. So that's just it. So you're correct that Ethiopia and Eritrea, without going, this is one of those areas of Africa that's quite complicated in terms of historical context, but the historical context is very important. Many people may know that Ethiopia is the only country in Africa that was never formally colonized by the Europeans. But there was a part of what was Ethiopia that was colonized, that was able to be colonized by Italy. And that's what Eritrea is. So Eritrea had to go through a long independent struggle to gain independence or decolonization, rather. It went through annexation by Britain to be made a part of Ethiopia. Now, we're talking about, obviously, pre-colonial Africa, where I identify as being African, even though I'm an African here by way of the slave ship. We're all African, and we have an identity. We should make sure we understand our identity. So most people say, well, Eritrea is just Ethiopia anyway, but we can't ignore the impact of colonialism and the right of people to decolonize and what you call irreversible consequences that has. So Eritrea then engaged in a war against Ethiopia. With that, they were fighting against Mengistu, who was the leader, supposedly Marxist, but really not really a Marxist leader of Ethiopia at the time. He was also collaborating with the United States a lot, and the CIA, which would not happen if a really socialist or revolutionary leader was involved. But and then also Tigray was a region of Ethiopia that was also fighting again within Ethiopia. There was the northern part that was fighting and actually neighboring Eritrea, fighting against this also very repressive regime, Mengistu. And then now the Eritrea, Eritrea is being led by the EPLF, the Eritrean People's Liberation Front. And then Tigray, the same, Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. And they would collaborate to fight the Ethiopia. So then, fast forward, eventually 1990, Eritrea was able to gain its independence. Tigray then, and also the Mengistu government fell, and the Tigray people were able to lead in the governance of Ethiopia. Now, after this, then they've had a number of changes in the government, or maybe just a couple changes in Tigray, Ethiopia. But then there were border disputes that were instigated a lot by Western powers over the border between Eritrea and Ethiopia. That was the latest war that you're talking about. And then, or the latest, war, I guess. There was sort of like a quelling, not to say, I wouldn't call it a ceasefire, but a very unstable peace where it wasn't the most heightened ongoing war going on, ongoing battles going on. But there was a relatively, non-combative, unstable peace along that border. Eritrea also, now, even though Eritrea, because of their liberation, how their liberation struggle was organized, has been able to organize a very sophisticated form of people's integrated organization, which would really it was just very unique, that also included the Eritreans in the diaspora and other parts of the world and how they supported their liberation struggle. That's how they won. And it also carried over to how their governance is. So in Eritrea, you actually have universal health care, universal education. It's a very revolutionary government. Some would call it socialist. They don't call it socialist because, one, I would rather defer to them to explain it more because I wouldn't be able to do it justice. I can't speak for the Eritrean people. But because of the experiences with the fake socialists under Mengistu in Ethiopia, then also the support of the Soviet Union gave to Mengistu because of the Soviet Union at the time, because he was claiming to be Marxist, and then just different groups that were actually not helping Eritrea in this situation in their fight for independence. Anyway, let me get back to the present. So the Western powers, Eritrea, by the way, and just to give some more very important geopolitical context, all of Africa right now is pretty much militarily dominated by the United States through AFRICOM, the U.S. Africa Command, where 43 out of the 54 countries on the continent have either a military base or military to military relationships and this kind of presence. And the United States, that's how the United States asserts its imperialist interests, or what we call neo-colonial domination on the continent. Eritrea is the only country that doesn't have that military relationship. And so they obviously are outlier in terms of what imperialism, imperialism, U.S. imperialism or Western imperialism doesn't like any countries to be charting in self-determination or anything like that. Now, fast forward to now, because it's, this very complex, is that the government in Tigray shifted, and that now you see the election or the emergence of the current prime minister. He's a prime minister, Ahmed. I don't really know how to pronounce his first name, but he's now the prime minister and was able to facilitate or broker a ceasefire and a peace agreement between Eritrea and Ethiopia. Unprecedented. That's part of the thing that got him the Nobel Peace Prize. And then the people of both countries want to see peace, because the people on the ground are never really as divided as leadership as they want to see, peace, because people die in wars and everything like that. And so they've been forging that. This has marginalized or the leadership of the Tigray leadership that was at some point at odds under this post-Eritrean independence struggle contention, and has alienated them from, or has caused tension between this region of Ethiopia and the federal government in Ethiopia, because of the that's what's caused the tension. Right now, this is the current situations has seemed to be precipitated by the fact that it seemed to be that the Tigray, that region, or at least the leadership there, has been doing things that the federal Ethiopian government has felt is sort of secessionist or separate, or just not, sort of renegade from the government, it's resulted in military skirmishes, and the federal government is, put in a position, or feels it's put in a position to quell that. And that's where we are right now. And they're also, the Tigray people are blaming or accusing, which is also what used to happen during the border disputes between Tigray and Ethiopia, accusing the federal government or Eritrea of them working together to undermine them. And so this is kind of the best I can do to kind of summarize that. There's a lot behind the scenes that has yet to be told. And for me, I would have to want to defer to some of the contacts that I have that are directly Eritreans, and Ethiopians like to know, to be able to untease more. I'll be honest, and I think that some of this stuff is, it could be, I don't have any smoking gun, but it also smells of the modus operandi of imperialism to cause dissension when they don't want regions to exercise self-determination. That's a very important region, the Horn of Africa, to U.S. interests or to imperialist interests in terms of the Seaway, the Red Sea, all that is just very strategic, and they don't really, that's why they're in Somalia so heavily and dealing with Kenya the way they are, and so Sudan. And so this is that's my initial take.
Thank you.
Great overview.
That's a great explanation. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. Great introduction. You know what? I'm gonna do this. We're kind of pushing up against a break. Nefta, thank you for being with us. We're gonna go into a break and bring you back on the other side. For those listening, Nefta Freeman is a policy analyst with the Institute for Policy Studies, a member of the coordinating committee of the Black Alliance for Peace, which, by the way, we were talking about earlier on with Margaret Kimberly. If you were listening then, you will remember that. She was highlighting them as prominent Black leaders in the progressive wing of global politics, not just American politics. In any event, we're going into a break. We'll be back with Nefta on the other side of this break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Back on the other side in just a minute.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and our guest, Nefta Freeman. He's a policy analyst with the Institute for Policy Studies. He's a member of the coordinating committee of the Black Alliance for Peace and a radio talk show host and producer. And by the way, on that last topic, you can catch his radio show Voices with Vision Tuesdays from 9 to 10 a.m. on WPFW 89.3 FM. Also check it out at WPFWFM.org. And Nefta, I'm just going to ask real quick. This is a D.C. area station, right? WPFW Talk and Jazz Music radio station in D.C.?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is. DC. It's the DC affiliate of the Pacifica Foundation.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, I've lived in D.C. for a bit, but not familiar enough with the stations there to know exactly what that is. But yeah, there you go. You can also, by the way, follow Nefta on Twitter at NetfaFree. That is spelled NETFAFREE. We're having an ongoing conversation in the last segment about Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Tigray, the Tigray People's Liberation Front. This follows. We could go back into it. You can listen to that last segment if you want to. We're actually turning the page to another topic in this segment, talking about U.S. and Africa policy related to that last segment under Biden. Nefta, as you were saying, you brought up some suspicions that possibly what's going on between Ethiopia and the Tigray People's Liberation Front in the past couple of weeks, broadly over the past couple of years, but there's been this spike in conflict in the last week. You were saying that might be a front for imperialism in some sort. You lack a smoking gun, but nevertheless, it bears a family resemblance to what the United States and other imperialist powers have done historically, trying to turn people against each other and basically suppress local movements. Or different words you could use for it. Or self-governance is one, or separatism is another. Broadly, how is Trump done? How did Obama do over the past couple of decades, looking at various presidents? What have their flavors been? And then sort of with that as context, how do you think Biden would act in relation to various countries in Africa? Nefta.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes it seems a little difficult to summarize certain things regarding Africa, particularly because I think there's such a low level of understanding about the geopolitical context and the history of Africa, particularly when it comes to U.S. relationships with Africa. But let's start with the Trump administration, or let's start with the Obama administration. So what we really, I think the most important thing to understand about U.S. foreign policy in Africa, U.S. policy in Africa, is that it's heavily facilitated through militarism. Militarism by the U.S. Africa Command, which is referred to as AFRICOM. It was created in 2007 and formalized in 2008, October 2008, created under the Bush administration, formalized in 2008. And in the initial stages of AFRICOM, it was widely rejected around the continent. They were looking for a place to have the headquarters of the U.S. Africa Command, as AFRICOM headquarters, and no country would have it because their people were rising up against, just making it clear that they didn't want U.S. militarism. And of course, there's lots of examples of why they would not want that around the world. There was exceptions of like Liberia, and I think it was one other, but I think Liberia was the main one that was entertaining it because Liberia has had a very close neo-colonial relationship with the U.S. The U.S., because it's never been able to formally colonize, be one of the formal colonizers that go way back into the early, 17, 1800s. It was and wasn't part of the Berlin Conference that divided up Africa and made all these states that we know of. It didn't get into the neocolonial game, or the game of what we call neocolonialism, meaning all of the outward trappings of independence that states have, but really, in reality, their economy and their politics is controlled by outside forces. That's neocolonialism. So the U.S. brags about not being a colonizer of Africa, but it's very much a neo-colonizer of Africa. It's more dominant than it's just very dominant in rivals like France and Britain. And so AFRICOM has proliferated under the Obama administration. There was a 1,900% increase of military presence, U.S. military presence on the continent.
That sounds like 20 times more. Just to interject really quickly, 1,900%. That's a several, one order of magnitude, and then a factor of two. Anyway,
exactly.
real quick, that's massive. And Nefta, this can fit into your response more generally, but I'm curious. I've heard this term before, and I think I know what it means. Probably broadly has to do with neoliberal policies and occasionally overthrowing governments when it fits our economic interests. But what do you use the word neocolonialism? What specifically do you mean by that?
Okay, so neocolonial. So, example, you did allude to one part of it is that they use certain class conflicts, particularly the leader class, the elite classes on the continent of Africa, kind of support them when it comes to elections or to trade relationships. They court them through. I don't know if you've ever read the book "Confessions of an Economic Hitman" by John Pilger, where they go and get them. Perkins, and there they get them to do foreign investment with and also it's facilitated by international institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization. These institutions, because they dominate the globe and the economy, can also dictate terms of trade and also and through sanctions and these kind of relationships. This is the domination of the continents, where the people of the continent are not determining what happens with all of the raw minerals and things that are extracted, how their labor is being used or what they're getting paid for. It's all being determined by outside. In fact, their markets are open to the Western world, where for example, Ghana, one of the biggest chocolate producing, cocoa, rather, that's used to make chocolate producing countries in the world, but they export all that at unfair reasons and have to import chocolate, refined or finished goods. And this is the relationship that all of Africa really pretty much has. Most of Africa has with the outside world, and particularly with the Western world. And so that's neocolonialism. So it's no direct rule like what colonialism was, or, British might have a governor and, in this role, even whether they're actually there settling or not, because there's also settler colonialism, like South Africa and those, but this is neocolonialism where they're dominating it in this way. Does that?
That does, yeah. But I mean, just specifically that last distinction. And I've looked into this before, but it's good to get a refresher. Thank you for that overview. I mean, specifically, instead of, like you're saying, instead of having a colony with a viceroy over it, some national governor from your nation, you sort of leave the countries nominally politically independent, while nevertheless maintaining a tight grip on the economies of the countries, the political leadership. Again, if you have the CIA overthrowing a country, you can't really say that it's politically independent to that extent. But there's nominal political independence other this sort of post-World War II UN-run space. Is that broadly what you're talking about?
That's exactly what I'm talking about. If you have a country, if you have like a leader like Kwame Nkrumah or Patrice Lumumba, then they come in and say, well, we're going to stop doing this cash crop mass cultivation of this thing and start using our land for things that we need, then they send in the jackals, as we say, and do something and which we know actually in that instance, the CIA has been directly involved in the overthrow of Kwame Nkrumah, both those examples I named, Kwame Nkrumah and Patrice Lumumba.
Yeah, it's time for freedom.
So that's and I kind of lost my train of thought. What your question was? I'm sorry. It was I was explaining. So that's the context of what. So anyway, back to Biden and then Trump. So Trump's policy. Trump when he came into office, actually, if we remember, he chose John Bolton to be his foreign policy advisor, and they unveiled what they call Prosper Africa. So they call themselves changing it from Obama. You know, everything that Obama did and under Trump was horrible. Now, this was horrible. I mean, I don't even, there's no issue with that. But it really was just repackaging the same thing and only saying that, well, we're not going to really work. Basically, and they called it Prosper Africa. We're not going to work so much with the global community. We're going to do our own thing, right? So that's what Prosper Africa was, but it's still the same thing, still didn't, change anything. And there have been some really, to speed it up a bit, really interesting contentions, so to speak, on the ground when it comes to how Africa has been. And then it's also, both under, no matter what administration, the Asia pivot that Obama initiated and everything, we know that the foreign policy in Africa, no matter who's in power, Republican or Democrat, is largely governed by the fact or motivated by the fact of competition with China. Some degrees with Russia, but mostly Russia and China. And so some shifts have happened. They've talked about Trump, because Trump, in my opinion, is not really a polished politician. He didn't really mean to be this and doesn't really understand particularly foreign policy. So they've talked about moving the AFRICOM base, which is in Stuttgart, Germany, actually, because they could never get it in Africa. They're about to move that. They're moving it. I don't know if they've actually completed that process, but they already started it. They've talked about earlier in this year, this shifting troops from West Africa to East because they're trying to deal with Al-Shabaab in Somalia, which is where there's also a heavy drone war going on there, drone killings and U.S. drone strikes. Now Trump, and on his way out, just not too few months, last month or whatever, talked about pulling U.S. troops out of Somalia, which of course all of the other imperialists do not agree with. I don't like Trump. I'm not saying he's anything good. I really think he's just, when it comes to foreign policy, he just doesn't really get that. And then he's just making these megalomaniac decisions. But what they're saying is, we believe in the Black Alliance for Peace. One, AFRICOM is just a destabilizing force, and that just needs to go. There's nothing about it. There's proof that shows this, has not halted terrorism, what it claims. And then besides, it's a disingenuous claim that that's what they're trying to do. So now under Biden, we can expect that they'll basically just return to, go back to what Obama has done. I think that the U.S. system predicated on neoliberalism, it doesn't have anything to offer but austerity, war, and more full spectrum dominance through militarism. They can't compete with China economically, and China's projects in Africa are largely infrastructural type things.
Djibouti, just to cut in here for a second, Djibouti, I believe it's Africa's largest port, largely funded by China at this point. And I think might be wrong about this, but please correct me if I am. I believe that China has one overseas military base currently, and that is in Djibouti.
Yeah,
that is, and so the United States moving troops from, I believe, you're talking about Western Africa. I think that's largely been Mali. I think that, other countries possibly in the region too, but similarly, you're dealing with terrorism in West Africa. That's ongoing as far as I can tell. But they're moving them to Somalia, not just to combat terrorism there, like they're saying, but also because China's moving in, and they want to sort of surround them.
Yes, that's correct.
Move.
US is
BD. It's not moving. China's there. China has all sorts of infrastructure projects in Africa, all throughout the country. Casinos and everything. When my wife and I were in Kenya, I think it was a couple of years ago, and you could see the influence. I remember reading one of the papers saying that America gave us over to the Chinese, because of the amount of investment in materials that were being in Africa. It's shocking. I think it was like 3 casinos. Chinese casinos in Kenya in and of itself to cater to that audience. Which is weird.
That's correct.
Because you have a situation where the United States has a heavy military presence, but China has a heavy infrastructure presence. That seems like such a strange back and forth.
In a way, it is, but if it's not as strange if we like think about the history between China and Africa and the U.S. and Africa, and then the fact that China, even though it's has a lot of what we would consider capitalist type and economic kind of stuff, it's able to do infrastructure better because it does have a socialist infrastructure and how it applies these things. It also has had more of a in the times of the liberation struggle, it was supported in the liberation struggles, whereas the U.S. was supporting like apartheid South Africa and trying to undermine, as we say. And so the relationship is different. And China and the United States, with its capitalist economy and neoliberalism, has a very unsustainable, it has nothing really to offer in terms of manufacturing things or being able to create infrastructure, infrastructure for Africa. So it's only got into extract the raw stuff, and is not really you never saw fit to have that kind of relationship with Africa, and can't get in on that now. It's too late.
Keeping supply lines open, basically keeping supply lines open for U.S. companies in terms of extracting resources. Nefta, we've got to close it out here. I wanted to hold you over actually for just a minute into this next segment. So I'm just going to ask you one question. We're holding a little bit longer than we normally would. I'm curious. This might seem like it's coming out of nowhere, but do you have any recommendations for books or documentaries? I want to learn more about this stuff. We're just talking about Eritrea and Ethiopia, but broadly also talking about neocolonialism. You were mentioning a number of rulers who've been overthrown by the U.S. Where should I go to learn more? I mean, thank you for joining us, but Nefta, can you give me some recs, please?
Okay, well, the first thing that comes to mind, because there's a number of things, is I recommend everyone should read Kwame Nkrumah's book. Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, independent Ghana. It's called Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism. He does an excellent job of really identifying what neocolonialism is, and particularly on the continent of Africa. There's a short video also that's called Crisis in the Congo. It's like 30 minutes on YouTube, and it actually deals with the Congo too, which, Kwame Nkrumah also has a book called Challenge of the Congo that people should read. We should also read Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa to get an understanding of some things. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that we could read, but those are some of my initial stuff, suggestions.
Thank you. Nefta, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
For those listening, Nefta Freeman is a policy analyst with the Institute for Policy Studies. He's a member of the coordinating committee of the Black Alliance for Peace, and he's a radio show host and producer, specifically of a show airing from 9 to 10 a.m. on WPFW 89.3 FM. That show is Voices with Vision. You can check it out there. Also go to WPFWFM.org and you can check it out. And also, last but not least, you can follow Nefta on Twitter at NetfaFree. That is NETFAFREE. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We're taking calls on the other side of this break. Our phone lines are open, 202-521-1320. Do call in. Be back in a minute. Fault Lines. See you on the other side.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune in to Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault Lines.
And we are back, and we are taking your calls. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and our phone lines are open. 202-521-1320. Again, 202-521-1320. Jamarl, I'm going to do a sharp turn here, unless there's something you want to talk about. Is there?
No, go for it. Make a sharp turn.
All right. Okay, so here's the sharp turn. Let's just assume for a second, I agree with you. Looking around, there's not as much evidence as I would like to see in order to believe that's the case, that, there's widespread voter fraud going on. We had Tom on the other day. He was talking about this stuff. But again, I would need to see more. It's a big claim that people are making, that there was enough voter fraud to overthrow the election to overthrow the results of the election, to put Biden into place instead of Trump. I'm not seeing enough evidence there. But if we assume for a second that there is, and that all that you need to do is for the DOJ to start digging for the Republican Party, for Trump's campaign to push, and once they start digging, they'll find some stuff. If there is, how should we view Trump's move specifically to get rid of Esper as Secretary of Defense, and potentially to get rid of Chris Wray, head of FBI, and to get rid of Gina Haspel, head of the CIA? If there is evidence there, in other words, I guess here's where I'm going with this. Like you were saying in your monologue, the sort of succession crisis, this institutional crisis with each presidential election that we're undergoing, it seems to be getting worse every 4 years, each time we have one of these presidential elections, where the Democrats will try to invalidate the Republicans if they win, and vice versa with the Republicans and the Democrats. If it was the case that there was voter fraud, how should we view what Trump has been doing and the claims that he's been making and all this stuff? Like if he's right, what take do you have? I'll just start right there, Jamarl.
Well, if he's right, because keep in mind, my argument has always been, I want a transparent election. I want people to be able to know who wins one way or the other. Whether I like the person or not, the idea of America matters more. If Donald Trump is right, and they have some kind of secret evidence that there is voter fraud, they need to show it. And if he can show it, the people who are responsible should be prosecuted. And beyond the people who are responsible should be prosecuted, either you're going to have to do something with the election result. Either you're going to have to run it again, you have to do something to make that work. Because I don't have this belief that Donald Trump is going to leave it. Like, he finds, let's say he's right. Let's say he finds voter fraud. And you find that, I don't know, a bunch of mail-in ballots were fraudulent or whatever. Do you honestly believe Trump is going to let that go? Let's say you find it in one state. Is he going to let it go for the other states the moment that you find it in one? I don't think he's going to let it go. I can't foresee a situation where he finds it, where Republicans find it, and they just say, okay, we're just going to let that ride. No, it's going to be issues with the election. It either gets sent to the House of Representatives, where the House of Representatives sends the delegation to the states to choose, because it's been so screwed up at that point. But I have a hard time believing that they would find it and nothing happens. Something would have to happen in regards to the election, because the public would not accept it. Do you really foresee a situation where Republicans being okay with finding it? Like, if they found a smoking gun, whatever that smoking gun was, let's say you found it in Pennsylvania, one state. Now, that doesn't apply to Wisconsin, that doesn't apply to Michigan, that doesn't apply to other states, but the moment that you find it in one, it sets the precedent that it exists. And it gives pretext to go looking elsewhere. Look, if Trump wins, Trump wins. I don't have a dog in this hunt. I keep telling people that, because I honestly don't. There's an advantage with Trump winning, believe it or not, from the standpoint of the left. Just like there are advantages if Biden wins from the standpoint of the left. I don't have a dog in it. So, it doesn't make sense. Like, something has to be done for the election.
Of course.
If they find it's fraudulent.
I hear you. I hear you. You're looking at this mechanically. I'll be honest. Here's what's going on. I've got some naivete here, where I'm still sort of shocked on a deep psychological level that each side is claiming that the other side is trying to execute a coup, which is effectively what's going on here, where the Democrats won, but if they hadn't won, I'm sure they would be saying, a similar level. They would be leveling a similar claim against Trump. Maybe not with voter fraud specifically, but. Yeah, the Russians, that there was some other outside entity or internal entity within the Republican Party that tried to overthrow it. But most likely they just try to blame it on the Russians again. That's
it is
the fact that our society is there.
I don't think people need to realize how disturbing this is. And because I think many Democrats only look at it from Trump. That's their heads. Their head says, oh, Trump is doing this. Missing the fact they did the exact same thing. When they went after Trump delegitimizing that election, they did the exact same thing. And then before that, when Trump was calling for Obama's birth certificate, he was doing the exact same thing. They're just handing off back and forth. I mean, I don't know. Like, this doesn't seem like it has a good endpoint. It just doesn't. I don't know. I don't know how this ends.
How do you? I guess here's another. This is on a sort of deeper, again, an attempt at a deeper psychological level. If I'm supposed to feel something about politics, if I'm supposed to be engaged, if if politics is supposed to be relevant in my mind, then how am I supposed to? I'm kind of stumbling because this is, again, it's like weird, mind-boggling, deep stuff.
But politics goes beyond just the typical voting or just the typical candidates.
Well, no, I hear you. But like any extent to which I choose to engage with the political system, if it's this messed up on a high level, why should I care? Why should anybody care? And so I completely get when we had Tim Canova on last week, and he was just like, "I'm out, guys." He kind of just brushed his hands in some sense, and not completely. And I don't want to misrepresent, but he was like on the same board as I was. Like, let's just go start a homestead. Let's just focus on what's within our control because the whole system is screwed on this high level. How are you supposed to, like, I can't, there's this cognitive dissonance where I'm trying to, that seems real to me. Like, I understand that take. And yet I also feel like I should care. Like, the whole world is at stake here on a very high level to a degree that's unprecedented in human history. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
it's
both
like
are
this
true.
Deep, weird, dissonant thing.
Yeah, both are true. I mean, usually when a task is monumental, the person loses energy. Like, they lose this drive. It's like, I can't jump that high, so I'm not even going to try. If it's within your sight, then you may be able to do it. And it's kind of that. It's like you look at the political challenge, you say, oh my God, this mountain, this seems just so insurmountable. By the same token, you also are like, but there's, I don't know the other option. If that makes, it's almost like you have to function regardless.
I hear, exactly. Yeah, you drive yourself crazy. We've got callers. I think we should go to them.
Yeah, go for it.
I didn't realize we had quite this many. Let's go straight to Brave in Atlanta. Brave. Sorry to say you got about 30 seconds, but please go right for it. Brave, you're on.
I'll be as swift as possible, bro. You guys are both right. Both are true. I have earlier, Jamarl said he was being very cynical or let me just say this. I have reached Heath Ledger Joker levels of cynicism with this whole thing. And I said it because I'm a nerd, so it's a Joker reference. I think we've been handed a sandwich knife and told it to spoon and given the choice of whether we're using one or the other side to eat with. That's what I think about our political system. I'm out. I'm totally out.
I hear you, man. I hear you. It's weird because I come in and I do this show and like it's all important stuff. And so like I do care about it, but at the end of the day, it's damn frustrating. And I'm cynical too. Anyway, Brave, thank you for the call. I think we're on the same page there when it comes to our emotional tenor. Ben in Ohio, you're on. You've got about 30 seconds. What's going on, Ben?
Hey, how are you guys doing? I just wanted to say I'm not at Heath Ledger levels of cynicism, but I'm more at like V for Vendetta. So there's that. Yeah, my main thing was basically in line with what you guys were saying. It was just sort of like if it escalates to a point where like the House has to create like a delegation or whatever to take it to the states and whatnot. My understanding is that I think the GOP actually has more influence in that case.
There are more states. Yeah, there are more states.
But regardless, the House would have to pick the president, and the Senate would pick the vice president. So we could have a situation where like Trump is like in a nightmare scenario, the vice president, and then runs again in 2024. If it
That'd be intense
in the worst possible way, but I don't know.
That's a very interesting. Ben, thank you for the call. Thank you for painting that possible future. I'm not gonna comment to that. I would kind of like to see that happen just because that would make for a very interesting 4 years. But that's admittedly even more cynical because at that point politics is just entertainment, and that's not healthy. Anyway, Ben, thank you for the call. Keith in Virginia, you got about 30 seconds. What's on your mind?
Okay, so to simply say that Trump's case is all fraud would be a mistake. He's not good at articulating what his case is. I'm not here to argue for him, but I'm saying the legal concept of ultra-virus acting or done beyond one's legal power or authority. Local officials in many of these precincts implemented policies to expand the voting freedom, liberalized voting in light of the pandemic. But in doing so, they didn't get authority from their governor or their state legislature. So the Supreme Court could technically say you acted ultra-virus and therefore we have to rescind this vote or whatever. And so it's much more complicated And I'm not saying Trump is the one. I'm not a Trump supporter, but people should be mindful that just to simply say Trump explained his case, he's not good. He's not a lawyer. So if you look at numerous articles from The Guardian, he does have a case if the facts are as he claims.
30.
His lawyer legal complaint. Thank you.
I just want to say, Keith, thank you for the call. Great factual call. Stuff for me to look into there. Thank you for the call. I believe that's a first-time call on your part. I appreciate you dialing in, and the same thing with Ben, and of course Brave too. We're signing off. Producers Cam and Raheem, thank you for your hard work. Thank you, Engineer Andre, for sticking with me this morning. Thank you, Jamarl Thomas, my fantastic co-host, and thank you, that is you, for listening. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. See you tomorrow, folks.
Another one in the books, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Guys, I want to thank all of you for joining us again on this crusade to hold the line. Let's see. Let's make sure you guys are going to see me a little bit later today, I believe. So I am going to say like, I'm going to say share and subscribe. I want to thank all of you for joining us as always. And I will see you guys a little bit later today.